Welcome to Nightshift Horror. Before we check in tonight, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now get comfortable. The night shift is about to begin.
Story 1. The Ward Entrance Log. The pen was moving across the page when I rounded the corner at 2:17 a.m. The blue ink forming letters in handwriting I didn't recognize but somehow found disturbingly familiar. I'd worked security at Hargrove Psychiatric Institute for 11 years, and the visitor log was sacred protocol. Every person who entered after hours had to sign in. Name, time of arrival, purpose of visit, and signature. The procedure was simple, mechanical, something I could verify at a glance during my rounds. The reception desk was empty when I arrived, the overhead fluorescents casting their usual sterile glow across the polished linoleum. The logbook sat open on the counter, and I could see fresh ink still glistening on the page. I approached slowly, my boots making no sound on the floor. The entry read, Thomas Brenner, 2:15 a.m., personal matter. Followed by a signature that matched the name perfectly, Thomas Brenner. That was my name. But I'd been on the third floor conducting welfare checks for the past 40 minutes. I hadn't been near the reception desk since my shift began at 10 p.m. I checked the hallway, the waiting area, the staff break room. Empty. The building held its usual late-night stillness. The soft hum of ventilation systems, the distant murmur of patient monitors, the occasional creak of old infrastructure settling. Nothing unusual except for the impossible signature in the log. I told myself it was a prank. One of the night nurses, maybe, or a staff member with too much time between rounds. But the handwriting bothered me. It wasn't quite mine, but it carried the same rhythms. The same slight backward slant I'd developed from years of writing reports in cramped security booths. I flipped back through previous pages, checking the pattern of entries. Visitors were rare after midnight, mostly family members arriving for emergency situations, or late shift staff signing in after schedule changes. Everything appeared normal until I reached the entry from exactly 1 week earlier. Thomas Brenner, 2:15 a.m., personal matter. The same entry, the same time, the same handwriting. I continued backward through the log. 2 weeks prior, Thomas Brenner, 2:15 a.m., personal matter. 3 weeks, 4 weeks. The pattern held consistently every 7th day, always at 2:15 a.m., always in that unsettling handwriting that resembled my own but felt wrong somehow. My hands were shaking slightly as I closed the logbook. I'd conducted thousands of patrols over 11 years, passed by this desk countless times and never noticed these entries. But they'd been accumulating, weekly signatures by someone claiming to be me, arriving at times when I was elsewhere in the building. The surveillance system, of course. Hargrove's security cameras covered every entrance, including the reception desk. If someone was forging my name in the visitor log, the footage would show them clearly. I returned to my station on the 2nd floor, logged into the monitoring system, and pulled up the archived feed for 2:15 a.m. that morning. The reception desk appeared on screen, empty and silent. The visitor log sat open on the counter exactly as I'd found it. The timestamp ticked forward. 2:14:58, 2:14:59, 2:15 song. The pen moved. I watched it lift from its holder beside the logbook, hover for a moment as if grasped by invisible fingers, then lower to the page and begin writing. The blue ink flowed smoothly, forming letters with deliberate precision. THOMASBRENNER. The pen completed the signature, returned to its holder, and became still. The logbook remained open, the fresh signature clearly visible in the camera frame. I rewound the footage and watched again. The pen moved by itself, guided by no visible hand, writing my name in handwriting that was almost but not quite my own. I checked the previous week's footage. Same phenomenon. 2 weeks prior. 3 weeks. Every instance showed the same impossible occurrence. A pen signing my name at 2:15 a.m. with no one present to hold it. Professional instinct told me to report this immediately. Document the anomaly, contact the night supervisor, follow protocol for unexplained incidents. But something deeper, more primal, kept me silent. This felt personal, intimate, like a message intended only for me. I began watching the footage in real time, monitoring the reception desk while conducting my scheduled patrols. The building around me felt different now, as if I were seeing it clearly for the first time. The corridors seemed longer, the corners darker, the spaces between locked patient rooms more expansive than I remembered. At 2:15 a.m. the following week, I positioned myself in the reception area, standing directly beside the visitor log with my hand resting on the counter. I needed to witness this phenomenon up close to understand what was happening. The clock on the wall ticked toward 2:15. My breathing was shallow, controlled, professional, despite the anxiety building in my chest. The pen sat in its holder, blue plastic catching the fluorescent light. 2:15ness. The pen didn't move. I stood there for 5 minutes watching, waiting. Nothing. Perhaps my presence had disrupted whatever caused the phenomenon. Perhaps it only occurred when no one was observing directly. I returned to my monitoring station and pulled up the live feed of the reception desk. The angle showed the visitor log clearly, the pen in its holder, the empty chair where visitors sat to sign in. And there, in the chair, was my own figure. I was sitting at the reception desk in the surveillance footage, holding the pen, carefully writing my name in the visitor log. But I was standing in my security booth on the second floor, watching this impossible reflection of myself moving independently on the screen. The figure in the footage, me, but not me, completed the signature, set down the pen, and looked up directly at the camera. His eyes met mine through the digital feed, and he smiled with recognition that made my blood freeze. Then he stood up and walked out of frame, heading toward the corridor that led to the second floor, heading toward my location. I spun around, facing the door to my booth. The corridor outside was empty, visible through the reinforced glass window. I could see the length of the hallway clearly. No one approaching, no movement, no sound except my own rapid breathing. But when I looked back at the monitor, the reception desk camera showed my figure still sitting in the chair, writing in the log again, creating a second signature beneath the first. I abandoned my station and ran to the reception area. The logbook lay open, and there on the page were 2 fresh entries, both timed at 2:15 a.m., both signed with my name in that almost but not quite my own handwriting. The surveillance footage had no explanation. I was documented in 2 places simultaneously, in my security booth reviewing monitors, and at the reception desk signing the visitor log. The timestamps were identical, the footage continuous with no signs of editing or technical malfunction. I checked the previous week's entries more carefully. Each signature was slightly different from the others, as if the handwriting were evolving, refining itself, gradually becoming more accurate. The earliest entries from months ago were rough approximations of my signature. Recent ones were nearly perfect replicas. Someone, something, was learning to be me. Over the following weeks, I noticed other anomalies. My scheduled patrol routes felt unfamiliar, as if the corridors had subtly rearranged themselves. Patients who'd never seen me before greeted me by name. Staff members mentioned conversations we'd supposedly had during times when I had documented alibis elsewhere. The visitor log continued accumulating my signatures, but now they appeared at different times throughout my shifts. 2:15 a.m. remained consistent, but additional entries began appearing at 4:30 a.m., 6:45 a.m., sometimes 3 or 4 per night, each one documenting my arrival for purposes I never understood. Personal matter, routine check, following up. I started signing the log myself during my actual patrols, creating a competing record of my genuine presence. But comparing my real signatures to the phantom ones became increasingly difficult. The handwriting was converging, becoming identical until I could no longer distinguish which entries were mine and which belonged to whatever was impersonating me. Last week I arrived for my shift and found the log already contained my signature for that evening, timed 30 minutes before I'd actually entered the building. The entry read, Thomas Brenner, 9:30 p.m., shift coverage. But my shift didn't begin until 10 p.m., and I'd been sitting in my car in the parking lot at 9:30 reviewing my phone before heading inside. I checked the surveillance footage. At 9:30 p.m., someone wearing my uniform carrying my keycard had entered through the main doors, signed the log, and proceeded to the second-floor security booth. The figure moved with my gait, held my posture, responded to staff greetings with my typical nods and brief smiles. I had watched myself arrive for work half an hour before I actually did. Tonight is my last shift at Hargrove. I've submitted my resignation, citing personal reasons, and the administration accepted without question. Perhaps they already know something I'm only beginning to understand. The visitor log sits open on the reception desk, and I can see entries stretching forward into next week, each one signed with my name, documenting shifts I haven't yet worked and arrivals that haven't yet occurred. But the most disturbing entry is dated for tomorrow morning, long after my employment will have officially ended. Thomas Brenner, 2:15 a.m., permanent placement. I don't know what happens when a place decides it needs you more than you need to leave. But I suspect the signatures in that log aren't documenting visits at all. They're recording something far more permanent, something that began the moment I first walked through these doors 11 years ago. Some buildings keep their own records, independent of the people who think they're maintaining them. And sometimes those records update themselves to reflect a reality that hasn't quite finished forming yet. Story 2. The elevator to sublevel 2. The scream that echoed from the sealed elevator shaft shouldn't have been possible, because there was no elevator there, just an empty vertical tunnel that had been decommissioned 15 years before I started working security at Millbrook State Psychiatric Hospital. I'd walked past the sealed elevator doors thousands of times during my 7 years on the night shift. They were located at the end of the West Wing, marked with faded out-of-order signs and covered with industrial yellow tape that had grayed with age and accumulated dust. The metal doors were solid, permanently locked, leading nowhere according to every blueprint and facility map I'd reviewed during my initial training. But on Tuesday night at 1:47 a.m., those doors opened when my keycard accidentally brushed against the call panel. I'd been conducting my standard patrol, checking door seals and monitoring the medication dispensary locks when my keycard lanyard caught on my equipment belt. The card swung outward and made contact with the defunct elevator's call button. I heard the electronic chirp of recognition, a sound that shouldn't have been possible from a system that had been powered down for over a decade. The doors slid open with a smooth hydraulic whisper, revealing a clean, well-lit elevator cabin that looked nothing like the outdated infrastructure elsewhere in the building. The interior was modern, almost corporate, with polished steel walls and soft LED lighting that created an ambient glow completely unlike the harsh fluorescent corridors of Millbrook. I should have reported this immediately. Protocol dictated documentation of any facility anomalies, while particularly involving systems that were supposed to be inactive. But curiosity, that dangerous occupational hazard of anyone who spends too many nights alone in institutional corridors, kept me standing there staring into the impossible elevator. The control panel inside showed 5 buttons, B2, B1, G12. Millbrook had a ground floor, 2 upper floors for patient housing, and a basement for storage and maintenance. There was no sublevel 2, no B2, no floor that extended that deep beneath the building's foundation. I checked the architectural plans on my security tablet, pulling up the digital blueprints that mapped every room, corridor, and utility space in the facility. The elevator shaft was marked as sealed and empty, terminating at the basement level with no indication of any sub-level structures. But the elevator was real, waiting with its doors held open by some sensor detecting my presence. The ambient hum of its mechanical systems was distinct from the building's usual background noise, carrying a different frequency, a different quality of mechanical patience. I stepped inside, telling myself I would simply verify that the control panel was malfunctioning, that pressing the buttons would produce no response, that this was merely an electrical glitch reactivating old systems without actually connecting them to anything functional. I pressed B2. The doors closed with decisive finality and the elevator began descending. I could feel the movement in my stomach, that familiar sensation of downward acceleration that told me this wasn't just lights and buttons activating. The elevator was genuinely moving, carrying me to a floor that didn't exist on any official documentation. The descent lasted longer than it should have. Traveling from ground level to a second sublevel should have taken perhaps 10 seconds. But I counted 30 seconds. Then 40, then 60, the elevator continuing its smooth downward journey into depths that couldn't possibly exist beneath Millbrook's foundation. When the doors finally opened, I found myself facing a corridor that belonged in a different building entirely. The hallway stretched before me in perfect institutional sterility, but the design language was all wrong. Where Millbrook's corridors showed decades of accumulated renovation and patchwork updates, this space looked purpose-built and completely consistent. The walls were smooth gray concrete. The lighting recessed into the ceiling at regular intervals, the floor polished to a reflective sheen that showed no signs of wear or foot traffic. Door plaques lined both sides of the corridor, each one marked with a room number and a patient name. But the names weren't familiar from any of Millbrook's current or archived records. I'd memorized most of the facility's patient roster during my years working security, and these names, Brennan, Kellner, Reeves, Morrison, Hartwell, carried no recognition. I walked down the corridor, my boots making no sound on the perfectly smooth floor. Each door had a small observation window, and through them I could see patient rooms that were simultaneously familiar and alien. The furniture matched Millbrook's standard issue: single bed, small desk, private bathroom. But the room showed no signs of habitation. No personal items, no clothing, no evidence that anyone had ever occupied these spaces. The corridor terminated at a nursing station identical to those on Millbrook's upper floors, but the monitoring equipment was more sophisticated than anything in our current facility. Multiple screens showed various angles of the empty rooms I'd just passed, along with views of other corridors I hadn't yet explored. And on one of those monitors I saw myself standing in the corridor behind me. I turned around, expecting to see my own reflection or perhaps understand that I was looking at a delayed recording. But the corridor behind me was empty. Yet on the monitor I watched myself walking past the same doors I'd just examined, my movement synchronized with my current position but somehow captured from an angle that didn't correspond to any visible camera placement. The intercom on the nursing station crackled to life. "Brennan, what are you doing in sublevel 2? The voice belonged to Linda Hartwell, my night supervisor, a woman I'd worked under for 7 years and whose mannerisms I knew intimately. Her tone carried its usual mix of professional concern and mild irritation. I reached for my radio to respond, but before I could key the transmitter, I heard her voice again, this time from directly behind me. "Thomas, I asked you a question." I spun around. Linda stood 10 feet away wearing her standard supervisor uniform, her arms crossed in her characteristic posture of administrative impatience. Her presence was completely solid, completely real. Completely impossible because she'd called in sick tonight and was supposedly home recovering from the flu. "Linda, how did you get down here?" She looked genuinely confused. "I've been watching you on the monitors since you entered the sublevel. You're not authorized to be in this section during standard patrol hours. But you're not on shift tonight, you called in sick." Now she looked concerned, the kind of expression she used when dealing with patients who were experiencing confusion or disorientation. "Thomas, I'm standing right here. Are you feeling all right?" I heard the intercom crackle again, and Linda's voice emerged from the speaker. "Brennan, respond please. What's your current location?" We both turned toward the nursing station. The voice was identical to the Linda standing beside me, but it was coming from the facility's communication system transmitted from some distant location. "That's impossible," Linda said, but her voice wavered with uncertainty that matched my own growing disorientation. I moved to the nursing station and picked up the intercom handset. "This is Brennan. I'm in sublevel 2, West Wing. Supervisor Hartwell is with me." A pause, then Linda's voice came through the speaker again. "Thomas, there is no sublevel 2. I'm looking at the facility monitors right now from the main security office. Your GPS beacon shows you standing in the ground floor West Wing corridor near the decommissioned elevator. You're alone." I looked at Linda standing beside me, solid and present and clearly confused. Then I looked at the monitors showing multiple views of the sub-level corridors, including the feed that showed both of us standing at the nursing station having this exact conversation. "Linda, what's happening?" The Linda beside me spoke at the same moment the Linda on the intercom responded. Both voices synchronized perfectly. "I don't know." The temporal impossibility of that synchronized response hit me with disorienting force. I was talking to Linda in person and over the intercom simultaneously, receiving identical responses from two sources that should have been completely separate. I pressed the intercom button again. "Linda, describe exactly what you're seeing on your monitors right now." The response came through the speaker. "You're standing in the ground floor corridor facing the sealed elevator doors, not moving. You've been standing there for the past 5 minutes, completely motionless. Thomas, you're starting to worry me. Should I call for medical support?" But I wasn't standing motionless on the ground floor. I was moving through sub-level 2, walking back toward the elevator while Linda, one version of Linda, followed beside me, her expression shifting from confusion to growing alarm. We reached the elevator doors. I pressed the call button, and the doors opened immediately, revealing the same modern cabin that had brought me down here. Linda stepped inside with me, and I pressed the button for the ground floor. The elevator began ascending, and I counted the seconds. 20, 30, 40. The journey took just as long returning as it had descending, moving through space that shouldn't exist, traveling distances that didn't align with Millbrook's actual structure. When the doors opened, we stepped out into the ground floor West Wing corridor, exactly where the decommissioned elevator should have been. The doors closed behind us and returned to their usual sealed state, the out-of-order signs perfectly in place as if nothing had changed. My radio crackled. "Brennan, what's your status? Your GPS beacon just jumped locations." I keyed the transmitter. "This is Brennan. I'm at the West Wing elevator with Supervisor Hartwell." "Thomas," Linda's voice came through the radio. "I'm still in the main security office. I'm alone here. Are you sure you're feeling all right?" I looked at the Linda standing beside me. She looked at me. We both looked at my radio as it continued transmitting Linda's voice from the security office, asking me to respond, expressing concern about my welfare. The Linda beside me spoke softly. I think I need to sit down. But as she moved toward the nearest bench, she began to fade. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, like an image losing resolution. Within 10 seconds, she was gone completely, vanished as if she'd never been present at all. My radio crackled again. "Thomas, please acknowledge. Should I contact medical?" "I'm fine," I responded, though my voice was shaking. "Just completing my patrol. Everything is normal." But everything wasn't normal. I checked my security tablet, pulling up the activity log that tracked my movements through the building via GPS beacon. According to the log, I'd been standing motionless in the ground floor west wing corridor for the past 12 minutes, exactly where the sealed elevator was located. There was no record of any elevator activation, no log entry for the B2 button press, no GPS data showing my descent to the sublevel that didn't exist. Yet I had clear memories of the entire experience. The corridor, the patient rooms, the nursing station, the conversation with Linda or whatever had appeared to be Linda. I approached the sealed elevator doors and pressed my keycard against the call panel deliberately this time, trying to recreate the accidental activation. Nothing. The panel remained dark, unresponsive, completely dead. But as I turned to continue my patrol, I caught my reflection in the polished metal of the elevator doors. And standing behind my reflection, visible only in the metal surface and not in the actual corridor, was Linda. Both Lindas somehow overlapping in the same space. One speaking silently while the other smiled with an expression of recognition that suggested she'd been waiting for me to notice. I completed the rest of my shift mechanically, documenting nothing unusual in my patrol log, maintaining the fiction of routine normalcy. But when I reviewed the surveillance footage from tonight, I found 12 minutes of recording showing me standing motionless before the sealed elevator, occasionally reaching out to touch the doors as if responding to something only I could perceive. The footage also showed something else. A faint image superimposed over the sealed doors, visible only when the video was slowed to half-speed frame analysis. It looked like an elevator cabin, modern and clean, with two figures inside, one wearing a security uniform, the other dressed in a supervisor's attire. Both figures were staring upward, as if watching floor numbers descending toward some destination far below the building's recorded foundation. Some elevators, I've learned, don't travel between floors that appear on blueprints. They connect to spaces that exist in the gaps between documented reality and architectural certainty. And sometimes the only way to know you've been to those places is to find yourself in two locations at once, speaking to people who are simultaneously present and absent, moving through structures that update themselves to include floors that were never built but have always been there, waiting to be discovered. Story 3. The shift log replacement. I found my own blood on the shift log before I'd cut myself, the crimson droplet still damp beside my signature, documenting an injury that wouldn't occur for another 3 hours. The shift log at Riverside Psychiatric Facility was a simple artifact of institutional routine. Each security guard documented their patrol activities in a spiral-bound notebook kept at the main security desk. Door checks, incident reports, equipment malfunctions, anything worth noting for the incoming shift. My entries were typically brief and functional. 2200, 2300, West Wing Patrol complete. All doors secure, no incidents. I'd been working the night shift for 4 years, and my handwriting in the log had become familiar shorthand, the abbreviated language of someone who'd written the same routine observations hundreds of times. Quick strokes, minimal detail, professional efficiency. But 3 weeks ago, I noticed someone had been editing my entries. The changes were subtle at first. My hasty scrawl would be replaced with neater, more methodical handwriting, filling in details I'd omitted or deemed unnecessary. Where I'd written North Wing Clear, the revised entry read, North wing clear, motion sensor in room 314 triggered at 0145. Investigation showed no cause, reset completed. I had no memory of a motion sensor trigger in room 314, but when I checked the electronic logs, there it was. A sensor activation at 1:45 a.m., automatically logged by the security system during my shift, though I'd apparently investigated and resolved it without consciously registering the event. The revised handwriting wasn't mine, but it wasn't entirely unfamiliar either. It carried the same basic letter formations as my own writing, but executed with more care, more precision, as if someone were taking time to write properly while I was always rushing through my documentation. I assumed another guard was reviewing my logs and adding missing information from the electronic systems. Perhaps a supervisor checking for thoroughness. I made no issue of it, though the practice seemed unnecessary. Then the additions began, including details not recorded anywhere else. 2330-030, basement corridor patrol, patient restraint chair in storage room B7 moved approximately 8 inches from previous position. No staff accessed room according to keycard logs. Chair returned to original position. I read this entry with growing discomfort. I had no memory of checking storage room B7. No recollection of finding the restraint chair moved. No awareness of repositioning it. But when I went to the basement and checked the room, I could see scuff marks on the floor suggesting exactly what the log described. Something heavy had been moved recently, then moved back. The additions continued throughout the week, each one documenting observations I'd somehow made without conscious awareness. Patient movements I'd witnessed but not registered. Equipment status changes I'd noticed but not processed. Subtle environmental details my eyes had recorded but my brain had filed away without examination. It was as if someone were extracting suppressed memories from my mind and transcribing them into the shift log in handwriting that was gradually becoming indistinguishable from my own. By the end of the second week, I could no longer tell which entries were mine and which were the mysterious additions. The handwriting had converged completely, evolved into identical formation and rhythm, until the shift log appeared to be written by a single author with extraordinary attention to detail. Then the temporal inconsistencies began. 0245 East Wing Medication Room. Inventory discrepancy noted. 3 dosages of lorazepam missing from secure cabinet. Incident report filed. I read this entry during my 2 a.m. patrol 20 minutes before the timestamp indicated. I hadn't yet visited the medication room, hadn't checked any inventory, hadn't filed any incident reports, yet there it was, documented in my own handwriting, describing events that hadn't yet occurred. I went to the medication room immediately and checked the secure cabinet. The lorazepam count was correct, fully accounted for with no discrepancies. I logged the verification and continued my patrol. At 2:45 a.m., I received an urgent page from the night nurse. 3 dosages of lorazepam were missing from the secure cabinet. Could I please file an incident report immediately? I stood in the medication room counting the inventory again, finding exactly the discrepancy that had been documented in the shift log 45 minutes before it occurred. My hands were shaking slightly as I filled out the incident report, replicating in real action what had already been recorded as historical fact. The precognitive entries multiplied. Each night the shift log contained observations about events that hadn't yet happened, written in my handwriting, describing my future actions with perfect accuracy. I would read about door checks I would perform 2 hours later, equipment issues I would discover during patrols I hadn't yet conducted, conversations I would have with staff members who hadn't yet arrived for their shifts. And I found myself following the log as if it were a script, performing each action it described, making each observation it documented, living out a patrol route that had already been written before I walked it. The most disturbing entries began appearing during my 4th week of experiencing this phenomenon. 0320 minor laceration on left forearm from collision with supply cart corner. Bandaged in first aid station. Minimal bleeding. I read this at 3:00 a.m. My left forearm was uninjured, unmarked, completely fine. I made a deliberate effort to avoid the supply cart during my 3:20 patrol, taking an alternate route through the east wing. At 3:18 a.m., an emergency call came from the patient wing requiring immediate response. I ran toward the location, taking the fastest route, which led me past the supply cart positioned exactly where I'd been trying to avoid it. The corner caught my forearm as I turned the corridor, opening a minor laceration that bled onto my uniform. I bandaged it in the first aid station at 3:23 a.m., following the script that had been written for me hours earlier. The blood on tonight's shift log appeared during my 1 a.m. documentation check. I hadn't injured myself yet, but there was my blood beside my signature, already dried, already documented in an entry that read, 400 significant laceration on right hand from broken window glass during patient disturbance response. Required 7 stitches at County General ER. Shift Supervisor Keller notified. My right hand was uninjured, but it was only 1 a.m. and according to the log, I had 3 hours before the injury would occur. I considered leaving immediately, calling in sick, refusing to complete the shift that had already been documented as ending in an emergency room visit. But something deeper than professional obligation kept me at my post. A growing awareness that the shift log wasn't predicting my future so much as documenting a reality that had already solidified, a timeline that had already been written and merely needed me to perform my role in actualizing it. At 3:47 a.m., patient Morton in room 218 began experiencing a violent psychotic episode, breaking his observation window and attempting to escape into the corridor. I responded according to protocol, helping staff secure him safely, and in the process, a shard of window glass that I didn't see coming opened a deep laceration across my right palm. Shift Supervisor Keller drove me to County General at 4:15 a.m. The ER doctor used 7 stitches to close the wound. Everything unfolded exactly as documented in handwriting that was indistinguishable from my own. I no longer write in the shift log. I simply read it at the beginning of each shift, learning what I will experience during the next 8 hours, following the predetermined patrol route that has already been documented by whatever force has learned to replicate my handwriting perfectly. Last night's entry included an observation that makes my blood cold. Final shift, Wednesday. No incidents. All systems normal. Resignation accepted. Next guard begins Thursday. But I haven't submitted my resignation. I haven't informed anyone of my intention to leave, yet the log has already documented my departure, written in my own handwriting, describing a decision I haven't consciously made but apparently will make before Wednesday's shift ends. Some records don't wait to be written. They anticipate what needs to be documented and prepare the pages in advance, leaving us to fill in the predetermined narrative with our lived experience, following scripts that were completed before we knew we were actors. Story 4. The night of the power failure. The lights died at exactly 11:42 p.m., plunging Meadowbrook Psychiatric Hospital into the absolute darkness that only occurs when every electrical system fails simultaneously. No emergency lighting, no exit signs, no glowing equipment displays, nothing but complete and suffocating blackness. I'd experienced power failures before during my 6 years working night security. They happened perhaps twice a year, usually during severe storms, and they followed predictable patterns. The main power would cut out, emergency generators would kick in within 5 to 10 seconds, and we'd operate on reduced lighting until utility crews restored the primary system. But this failure was different. The emergency generators didn't activate. The backup lighting remained dark. And strangest of all, the security monitoring station where I sat remained fully powered. All screens glowing with perfect clarity, showing camera feeds from throughout the facility as if nothing had changed. I reached for my radio to coordinate with the other guards, but the device was dead, completely non-responsive despite having fresh batteries. My cell phone showed no signal. The desk phone produced no dial tone. Every communication system had failed except for the security monitors, which continued displaying their feeds with absolute normalcy. The feeds showed the building in darkness. Patient room cameras revealed shadowy spaces lit only by moonlight filtering through barred windows. Corridor cameras showed empty hallways lost in blackness. But the monitoring station itself remained fully illuminated, creating an island of light in a facility that had gone completely dark. I sat there for several minutes, waiting for some sign of the emergency generators activating, some indication that the standard procedures were unfolding as expected. But the darkness held, and the monitors kept showing me views of a hospital that no longer had power to operate its surveillance systems. Then I noticed the anomaly. Camera 7, East Wing, second floor corridor Sudan, was showing a section of the building that no longer existed. The view displayed a long corridor lined with patient rooms, but the architecture was wrong. The current East Wing had been renovated 3 years ago, the old corridor demolished and replaced with a modern layout featuring semi-private rooms and wider hallways. The camera feed was showing the old configuration, the pre-renovation design, complete with the outdated room numbers and the distinctive green tile that had been removed during the reconstruction. I checked the camera label. E2 Core R01, active. According to the monitoring system, this was a live feed from an active camera in the current East Wing. But it was showing a corridor that had been torn down in 2019. I cycled through other camera views. Most showed the expected modern layout, darkness obscuring details, but architecture recognizable. But several cameras, camera 7, camera 12, camera 18, camera 23, showed impossible views of demolished spaces, old corridors, removed rooms, architectural features that no longer existed in the physical building. And in camera 7's feed, I saw movement. A figure walked down the old corridor, moving with the measured pace of someone conducting a security patrol. The person wore a uniform identical to mine, carried equipment that matched my standard gear, and moved with a gait I recognized because I'd seen it in reflected windows and surveillance playback hundreds of times during my years working here. The figure in the old corridor was me. I watched myself conducting a patrol through spaces that had been demolished years before I'd started working at Meadowbrook, checking doors that no longer existed, following a route that was no longer possible in the current building layout. The camera angle provided perfect visibility, tracking my movements with professional precision as I moved through the impossible architecture. I stood up from the monitoring desk, intending to investigate, to verify my physical location, to confirm that I was really here in the security station and not somehow simultaneously walking through demolished corridors. But as I moved toward the door, camera 1, security station interior, showed me still sitting at the desk, motionless, staring at the monitors. I looked at the screen. My stationary figure looked at the monitors. The figure in camera 7 continued walking through the old corridor, conducting patrols in architectural history. 3 versions of myself, documented by the surveillance system, existing in 3 different spatial relationships to the facility's timeline. The power failure continued. My radio remained dead. The monitoring station stayed lit with impossible consistency while the rest of the building languished in total darkness. I sat back down, or remained sitting, or continued patrolling demolished corridors depending on which camera feed represented actual reality, and watched the surveillance system document multiple simultaneous versions of my presence, throughout the facility. Camera 12 showed me in the old staff break room, the one that had been converted into medical storage after the renovation. I was pouring coffee from a pot that no longer existed, sitting at a table that had been donated to surplus years ago, reading a newspaper with a date I couldn't quite make out, but which seemed to be from several months before I'd been hired. Camera 18 showed me responding to an emergency in a patient room configured in the old layout, helping staff I didn't recognize restrain someone experiencing a crisis, performing security duties in a scene that had the quality of archived footage except for the timestamp reading live 23:47:16, updating in real time. Camera 23 showed me conducting a routine door check in a corridor that had been partially demolished to create the new therapy wing, my flashlight beam cutting through darkness that existed in architectural past but not present geography. The most disturbing feed was Camera 31, main entrance exterior. It showed me leaving the building, walking across the parking lot to my car, driving away into the night. The timestamp read 23:52:08, suggesting I was watching myself depart from my shift 8 minutes from now, or 8 minutes ago, temporal logic becoming increasingly meaningless as I watched multiple versions of myself occupy different timelines simultaneously. The power restored at 12:07 a.m., exactly 25 minutes after it had failed. Emergency lighting flickered on first, then full illumination returned in sections, systems rebooting according to standard protocols. The monitoring station briefly went dark before its screens reactivated with the distinctive startup sequence of equipment cycling through restart procedures. When the cameras came back online, they showed the current building layout exclusively. Renovated corridors, modern rooms, contemporary architecture. The impossible feeds of demolished spaces had vanished, replaced with expected views of Meadowbrook's current configuration. But on Camera 7, the footage continued playing. The screen showed the old corridor, the pre-renovation architecture, and my figure still conducting patrols through spaces that no longer existed. The timestamp continued updating. 0:07:43, 0:07:44, 0:07:45, marking time that was current but documenting actions in spaces that were historical. I was no longer in the frame of any other camera. Camera 1 showed the security station with an empty chair. Camera 12 showed the medical storage room with no one present. Camera 18 showed a quiet patient room in its modern configuration. Camera 23 displayed the new therapy wing corridor, vacant and properly lit. Only Camera 7 retained my presence, tracking my continued patrol through architectural history, documenting my ongoing security duties in a version of the facility that existed now only in surveillance memory. I stood up from my chair and walked to the East Wing to physically verify my location, to prove that I existed in actual space and not merely in impossible camera feeds. The corridor looked exactly as it should, modern, renovated, matching the current blueprints. I walked its length, checking doors, verifying my tangible presence in contemporary architecture. When I returned to the monitoring station, Camera 7 still showed me walking through the old corridor. But now there were two figures visible in the frame, the version of me conducting historical patrols, and a second figure that had just entered from the far end of the demolished corridor, walking toward the camera with purposeful stride. The second figure wore my uniform, carried my equipment, moved with my gait. As it approached, passing under one of the old fluorescent fixtures that no longer existed in physical reality, its face became visible in the camera feed. It was me, but older. Perhaps 10 or 15 years older, with gray touching my temples and lines around my eyes that I didn't yet have. The older version of myself nodded to the younger version still conducting patrols, a gesture of recognition between temporal iterations of the same person occupying the same demolished space through different surveillance timelines. Both figures continued their patrols, moving through the old corridor in opposite directions, passing through the same doors, checking the same rooms, performing security duties that remain necessary despite the physical spaces having been demolished years ago. I watched them until my shift ended at 6:01 a.m. These versions of myself maintaining vigilance over architectural history, ensuring the security of spaces that existed now only in camera memory and electromagnetic documentation. The next night, Camera 7 showed 3 figures conducting patrols in the old corridor. The newest was the version of me from tonight, joining the accumulated iterations that the surveillance system had collected during previous power failures, building a staff of temporal duplicates maintaining security over the building's demolished past. I've worked 73 more shifts since that night, and I've experienced 6 additional power failures. After each one, Camera 7 shows another version of me added to the patrol rotation in the old corridor, multiple iterations of my presence conducting overlapping security checks in spaces that no longer exist except in the electromagnetic persistence of surveillance memory. The monitoring system now requires 47 screens to display all the camera feeds documenting different temporal versions of the facility. Most guards can only see the 17 screens showing current architecture, but I can see all 47 watching myself multiply across demolished timelines, accumulating presence in the gaps between architectural history and surveillance continuity. Some buildings maintain ghost wings that exist only in camera memory, preserved by surveillance systems that document spaces more permanently than physical architecture. And some security guards patrol those ghost wings indefinitely, their duties extending beyond employment termination, and even beyond the demolition of the spaces they're tasked to protect, accumulating across power failures until every version of their presence has been recorded and assigned a permanent patrol route through electromagnetic history. Story 5. The Visitor Pass. The Visitor Pass was still warm when I picked it up from the reception desk, the laminated plastic holding body heat from whoever had just set it down, though the lobby had been empty when I arrived for my 3 a.m. patrol. I worked the graveyard shift at St. Mary's Psychiatric Treatment Center, and the visitor protocol was absolute. No guests after 8 p.m. without prior authorization from the facility administrator. The building locked down at night, exterior doors secured, the only access requiring keycard authentication that logged every entry and exit in the security database. But here was a visitor pass, freshly issued according to its warmth, lying on the reception counter in a lobby that should have been inaccessible to anyone without authorized credentials. I examined the pass carefully. The format was outdated, using a template we discontinued 6 years ago when the facility switched to a digital visitor management system. The name read Eleanor Pritchard, and the visit date was printed clearly. October 14, 2012. 11 years ago, the pass showed signs of age, slight discoloration around the edges, a small crease in the upper right corner. But it also appeared recently handled, as if someone had been carrying it regularly, keeping it accessible despite its obsolete format and impossibly old date. I checked the reception desk computer, pulling up the visitor logs from tonight. No entries. The last recorded visitor had signed out at 7:23 p.m., a family member visiting a patient on the secured ward. Nothing since then. No indication that anyone had entered the building through official channels. But the pass was real, tangible, warm from recent contact with human skin. I placed it in my equipment pouch and continued my patrol, checking the ground floor corridors before moving upward through the building's 3 residential levels. Everything appeared normal. Locked doors, quiet patient rooms, the usual institutional silence of a psychiatric facility in the deepest hours of night. When I returned to the ground floor lobby at 3:47 a.m., a woman was sitting in the visitor area waiting patiently in one of the rigid plastic chairs positioned near the elevator bay. She was perhaps 60, dressed in clothing that seemed slightly out of fashion. A wool coat with a style that suggested an earlier decade, practical shoes that looked worn but well-maintained. Her posture was calm, hands folded in her lap, gaze directed toward the elevator doors with the patient expectation of someone accustomed to waiting. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said, my voice carrying the professional courtesy that masked my intense confusion about her presence. Visiting hours ended at 8 p.m. "How did you get into the building?" She turned to look at me, and her expression carried a combination of mild surprise and gentle correction, as if I'd made an understandable mistake that required polite clarification. "You cleared me yourself," she said. "About 10 minutes ago. You checked my visitor pass and told me to wait here while you verified my son's location. I'd conducted no such clearance. I'd been on the upper floors for the past hour, nowhere near the lobby, with no radio communication from any other staff members about visitor authorization. Ma'am, I need to see your identification and visitor pass." She reached into her purse and produced a pass identical to the one I'd found on the reception desk. Same outdated format, same name, same impossible date. Eleanor Pritchard, October 14th, 2012. "This pass is 11 years old," I said. "It's no longer valid, and I didn't authorize your entry tonight." Her expression didn't change, maintaining that same patient, slightly puzzled demeanor. "Of course you did. I wouldn't be here otherwise. I'm here to visit my son, Thomas. He's been a patient here for several months now, and I visit him every week at this time. I knew every patient currently housed at St. Mary's. There was no Thomas Pritchard on our census, no resident matching any variation of that name in our current or recent records. Ma'am, there's no patient named Thomas Pritchard in this facility. I'm going to need you to come with me to the security office while we verify your authorization." She smiled with the tolerance of someone dealing with bureaucratic confusion. "Thomas is in room 237, second floor, East Wing. He's been there since his admission in August. You've escorted me to visit him several times yourself. Room 237 was currently vacant, held in reserve for emergency admissions. It had been unoccupied for the past 6 weeks. I reached for my radio to call for assistance, but before I could key the transmitter, Eleanor Pritchard stood up and walked toward the elevator as if our conversation had reached its natural conclusion, and she was proceeding with her authorized visit. "Ma'am, please stop." She pressed the elevator call button. The doors opened immediately, responding with unusual speed, and she stepped inside with the familiarity of someone who'd made this journey many times before. I followed her into the elevator, positioning myself between her and the control panel. "I cannot allow you to proceed to the patient floors without proper authorization." She looked at me with an expression of gentle persistence. "You've already authorized me. You've been authorizing me every week for months. Thomas is expecting me." The elevator doors closed before I could prevent them, and I felt the cabin begin ascending despite my not having pressed any floor buttons. We rode in silence, Eleanor watching the floor indicator with calm anticipation while I struggled to understand how she'd gained access to a secured building and activated an elevator that required keycard authentication. The elevator stopped at the second floor, and the doors opened directly onto the East Wing corridor. Eleanor stepped out confidently, turning left toward room 237 as if navigating familiar territory. I followed her, maintaining professional presence while my mind raced through possible explanations. Dementia patient who'd wandered in, delusional individual experiencing elaborate false memories, some kind of administrative error that had cleared her visit without my knowledge. Eleanor stopped at room 237 and knocked gently on the door. "Thomas?" It's your mother." The room was empty. I knew it was empty. I checked it myself during my 2 a.m. patrol, verifying its vacant status for the census report. But when Eleanor opened the door and stepped inside, the room was occupied. A young man, perhaps 25, sat on the bed wearing standard patient clothing. The room showed signs of habitation. Personal items on the desk, clothes in the closet, the distinct lived-in quality of a space that had been someone's residence for weeks or months. "Mom," the young man said, standing up to embrace Eleanor. "I was worried you wouldn't make it tonight." I stood in the doorway, staring at an occupied patient room that had been empty 40 minutes earlier, watching a woman who shouldn't be in the building embrace a patient who didn't exist in any official records. "I'm sorry I'm late," Eleanor said. The security guard was very thorough with his verification procedures. Thomas looked at me and smiled with recognition. "Evening, Officer Brennan. Thanks for escorting my mother up. I appreciate how carefully you check her credentials each week." He knew my name. He spoke with the familiarity of repeated interactions, referencing weekly visits I had no memory of authorizing, security procedures I'd never performed. I pulled out my security tablet and checked the facility census. Room 237 showed as vacant, unassigned, available for emergency admissions. But I was standing in a clearly occupied room, watching a patient who didn't exist according to official records interact with a visitor who was carrying an 11-year-old pass and claiming I'd been clearing her weekly visits for months. "Thomas," I said, "can you tell me your admission date?" He looked slightly confused by the question, but answered politely. "August 17th, 2012. I've been here about 2 months now. You've been my primary security contact since I arrived. We've spoken many times." August 17th, 2012. 11 years ago. I checked the facility archives on my tablet, searching for any historical record of a patient named Thomas Pritchard. The search returned a single result: a patient who'd been admitted on August 17th, 2012, housed in room 237, whose treatment had been terminated abruptly on October 14th, 2012, following a fire that had damaged the East Wing and killed 3 people, including the patient and his visiting mother. Eleanor Pritchard's visitor pass had been found in the debris, partially burned but still identifiable, date-stamped for the day of the fire. I looked up from my tablet. Eleanor and Thomas were still there, solid and present, continuing their visit with quiet conversation about his treatment progress and her concerns about his medication adjustments. They existed in tangible reality despite all documentation indicating they died in a fire 11 years earlier. "Officer Brennan," Thomas said, "is everything all right? You look concerned." I closed my tablet. What could I say? That they were dead? That the room they occupied was officially vacant? That the visit they were conducting couldn't be happening according to every official record? "Everything's fine," I heard myself say. "Take your time with the visit. I'll be at the nurse's station if you need anything." I backed out of the room and closed the door, leaving them to their impossible reunion. The room appeared vacant when I looked through the observation window. Empty bed, clear desk, no signs of occupation. But I could hear faint voices inside, muffled conversation continuing beyond the closed door. Eleanor Pritchard found me at the nurse's station 40 minutes later, thanking me for facilitating her visit and assuring me she'd return next week at the same time. She walked to the elevator, stepped inside, and descended to the ground floor. When I checked room 237 again, it was empty, returned to its official vacant status. But on the reception desk, I found her visitor pass waiting, still warm, dated October 14th, 2012, ready to authorize next week's visit to a patient who died 11 years ago but continues receiving family calls at regular intervals, in a room that's simultaneously empty and occupied, documented by a security guard who clears the same visitor repeatedly without ever remembering that he's been doing so for over a decade. Some visits don't end just because the living have left. They continue on their scheduled intervals, maintained by visitor passes that never expire and security authorizations that persist beyond the deaths of everyone involved, creating pockets of ongoing presence in rooms that official records insist are vacant, but which remain occupied by those who have nowhere else to be. Story 6. The mirror in the observation room. My reflection stopped following me at exactly 2:33 a.m. and I knew because I was checking my watch when it happened, looking down at the time while my reflection in the observation room mirror continued staring straight ahead. The observation room at Pinewood State Psychiatric Hospital was standard institutional design. A small space on one side of a two-way mirror, allowing staff to observe patients in the adjacent therapy room without being seen. I'd stood in that observation room hundreds of times during my 8 years working night security, watching therapy sessions, monitoring high-risk patients, verifying treatment compliance through the anonymity of mirrored glass. The mirror had always made me vaguely uncomfortable. Something about the two-way nature, the way it could be window or reflection depending on which side you occupied, created a subtle disorientation. I'd sometimes lose track briefly, standing in the observation room but feeling like I was the one being watched, like I'd somehow crossed to the wrong side without realizing it. But tonight was the first time my reflection had actually demonstrated independence. I'd been conducting a routine patrol check, verifying that the observation room was secure and empty as it should be at this late hour. I'd glanced at my watch to log the time, and when I looked up, my reflection was still staring forward, making eye contact with me despite my own gaze being directed downward at my wrist. For a moment I froze, caught between my actual position and my reflected position, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what should have been physically possible. Reflections don't maintain independent posture. They can't continue looking at you when you've looked away. I raised my right hand slowly. My reflection didn't respond, remaining motionless, arms at its sides, watching me with patient attention. I stepped to the left. My reflection stayed centered in the mirror, not tracking my movement, holding its position as if anchored to a different spatial relationship than the one I occupied. Then it stepped backward, moving deeper into the reflected space, retreating from the mirror's surface until it reached the back wall of the observation room. Except the reflected observation room extended further than the actual room, containing depth and distance that didn't exist in the real architecture. My reflection turned and walked through a door in the back wall of the reflected space, a door that had no counterpart in the actual observation room. It vanished from view, leaving the mirror showing an empty observation room that didn't quite match the one I was standing in. From the adjacent therapy room, I heard laughter. I moved to the two-way glass and looked through from the observation side. The therapy room was supposed to be empty, locked and unoccupied during the night hours. But there was a patient sitting in the standard therapy chair, a young man I didn't recognize from our current census, laughing with the kind of unrestrained amusement that suggested either genuine humor or complete dissociation from normal emotional context. "Good evening, Martin," he said, looking directly at the mirror, making eye contact with me through the supposedly one-way glass. "Your reflection went looking for you." He knew my name. He was looking at me through glass that should have appeared as a mirror from his side, seeing me when he shouldn't have been able to perceive anything but his own reflection. "Who are you?" I asked, knowing he shouldn't be able to hear me through the insulated observation room, but asking anyway. "You know who I am, Martin. We've met every night for the past 3 months. Well, not me exactly. The version of you that stays on the other side of the mirror, the one that's been taking your shifts when you're not looking." I backed away from the glass. This was impossible. Patients couldn't see into the observation room. My reflection couldn't walk through non-existent doors. And I certainly hadn't been meeting with anyone during my patrols. But the young man continued talking, his voice carrying through the glass as if the barrier between us had become permeable. He's looking for you right now. The reflection you. He's been trying to tell you something important, but you keep looking away at the wrong moments. That's why he stopped following. He needs you to pay attention. Pay attention to what? To which side of the mirror you're really on. It's easy to get confused standing in observation rooms looking through glass that's simultaneously window and reflection. Sometimes you forget whether you're watching or being watched. Sometimes you cross over without noticing. I looked down at my hands, verifying their solidity, their reality. I was Martin Brennan, 42 years old, night security guard at Pinewood State Psychiatric Hospital, standing in an observation room conducting my scheduled patrol. This was real. I was real. But when I looked at the mirror again, I saw myself in the therapy room, sitting in the patient chair, while the young man I'd been seeing stood in my position in the observation room wearing my uniform, looking through the two-way glass at me. I spun around, trying to verify my position. I was still in the observation room. I could see the door I'd entered through, the monitoring equipment, the familiar layout I'd known for 8 years. But the mirror showed me in the therapy room. And the patient, or was he the guard, was speaking again. There we go. Now you're starting to see it. The reflection problem. You've been crossing back and forth for months, Martin. Sometimes you're the guard watching patients. Sometimes you're the patient being watched. The mirror doesn't care which side you start from. It just reflects whatever's there, and sometimes what's reflected becomes more substantial than what's real. I pressed my hands against the two-way glass, feeling its solid surface, confirming the barrier between observation room and therapy space. But my reflection in the mirror showed me with my hands pressed against the other side, trying to get out rather than looking in. Your reflection went to find the original you, the young man continued. The version that hasn't been crossing back and forth through mirrors. He's trying to warn you that you've been on the wrong side for a while now, just going through the motions of security patrols while actually being one of the patients you think you're guarding. That's not possible, isn't it? When's the last time you went home, Martin? When's the last time you remember your life outside these walls? You arrive for your shift, you patrol the corridors, you check the rooms, and then suddenly you're arriving for your next shift with no memory of the time between. That's because there is no time between. You're not leaving. You're here continuously, crossing back and forth through observation mirrors, taking turns being the guard and being the patient, forgetting which role is real and which is reflection. I tried to remember going home yesterday, parking my car, entering my apartment, sleeping in my bed. The memories felt thin, generic, like templates rather than actual experiences. The reflection you saw walking away, that's the real Martin Brennan, the one who hasn't forgotten which side of the mirror he started from. He's been trying to get your attention for months, leaving signs, breaking the reflection pattern, hoping you'd notice something was wrong. From behind me, I heard a door open. I turned and saw myself. My actual reflection, the one that had walked through the impossible door. Standing in the observation room entrance. We need to switch back, my reflection said. You've been on the wrong side too long. The mirror confusion is getting worse. Soon you won't remember you're not supposed to be a patient. I looked at my reflection, then at the young man in the therapy room, then at my own position in the observation room that suddenly felt less certain, less definitively real. How do I know which one of us is real? My reflection smiled sadly. That's the problem with mirrors in observation rooms. Eventually, you can't tell anymore. Both sides feel equally valid, equally substantial. But one of us has to stay on the patient side, Martin. The mirror won't work properly if we both try to be guards. The young man in the therapy room, or was he in the observation room, was laughing again, repeating my name like an incantation. Martin Brennan, Martin Brennan, Martin Brennan. I'm still not sure which side of the mirror I'm really on. Sometimes I conduct security patrols, checking observation rooms and verifying patient safety. Sometimes I sit in therapy rooms being observed through two-way glass by guards who look exactly like me. And sometimes I meet my reflection in the space between, both of us trying to remember which one of us crossed over first and which one has been living in the mirror all along. Story 7. The Basement Corridor Patrol. The humidity alarm chimed for the 47th consecutive night at exactly 3:17 a.m., indicating catastrophic moisture levels in the basement corridor that had been sealed and condemned for the past 8 years, following flood damage from a ruptured water main. I'd worked night security at Whitmore Psychiatric facility for 6 years, and the basement alarm had been a constant companion during that entire tenure. Every night, same time, same reading, humidity levels at 98%, temperature at 54 degrees, conditions consistent with standing water and active flooding. But the basement was dry. I'd verified this personally during my first week on the job, obtaining administrative clearance to physically inspect the sealed corridor and confirm that the sensors were malfunctioning. The space had been completely dry, showing no signs of water damage beyond the original flood stains from years earlier. The concrete floor was dusty, the walls marked with waterline residue but entirely desiccated, the air stale but certainly not humid. I'd filed multiple maintenance requests to have the faulty sensors replaced or the alarm system recalibrated. Each request received the same response. Sensors functioning within normal parameters, no maintenance required, as if nightly false alarms indicating flooding in a dry, sealed corridor were perfectly acceptable operational behavior. Eventually, I'd learned to simply acknowledge the alarm, log it in my patrol notes, and continue with my duties. The basement sensor had become background noise, an institutional quirk that bothered me less than it probably should have. Until last Tuesday, when the camera feed started showing something the physical inspection had never revealed. Whitmore had installed a single security camera in the sealed basement corridor years ago, more as a formality than active surveillance. The feed was buried deep in the monitoring system's menu structure, rarely viewed, generally forgotten. But the humidity alarm was logged to the same system, and one night I decided to pull up the corresponding camera view, curious to see what the sensors were detecting that physical inspection had missed. The corridor appeared exactly as I remembered from my inspection. Long, empty, lit by emergency lighting that created pools of illumination separated by stretches of shadow. The concrete floor showed the expected water stains, dark patches marking where floodwater had pooled 8 years earlier. Perfectly dry, perfectly still, perfectly consistent with a sealed space that had been undisturbed for nearly a decade. I was about to close the feed when I noticed the footprints. They weren't there at first. The corridor was empty, marked only by old stains. But as I watched, new marks began appearing on the concrete. Wet footprints forming slowly, methodically, one after another in a walking pattern that progressed down the corridor toward the camera position. The prints were fresh, clearly defined, leaving damp impressions that glistened in the emergency lighting. They appeared continuously, each step materializing as if someone invisible were walking through standing water, tracking moisture across a dry floor. I checked the humidity reading, 98%. I checked the camera timestamp, 3:17 a.m. I checked my own position safely in the security control booth on the ground floor, nowhere near the basement. But the footprints continued forming, advancing steadily down the corridor with the measured pace of someone conducting a patrol. They moved through the emergency light pools, clearly visible, then through the shadowed sections where they were harder to distinguish but still perceptible as darker, wet marks against gray concrete. The pattern was uncomfortably familiar. The stride length, the slight outward angle of the right foot, the way the prints showed more weight on the heel than the toe. I'd seen these patterns before in wet footprints I'd left myself when walking through puddles during facility patrols. These were my footprints, my gait, my stride, my walking pattern. But I was on the ground floor watching the camera feed, absolutely not in the sealed basement corridor. The invisible walker reached the end of the corridor where the camera was mounted and stopped. The final footprints formed directly beneath the camera position, pointing upward toward the lens as if the person who'd left them was now standing still, looking up at the monitoring equipment, aware of being recorded despite their invisibility. I zoomed the camera in, trying to capture any detail that might explain what I was seeing. The footprints remained clearly visible. Wet impressions that should have been evaporating in the supposedly dry air, but which maintained their damp definition as if the person who'd left them was still standing in them, preventing them from drying. Then I noticed the water. It wasn't there a moment ago, but now I could see it clearly in the camera feed. A thin layer of water covering the entire corridor floor, reflecting the emergency lights like a dark mirror. The sealed basement corridor was flooded, filled with perhaps an inch of standing water that rippled slightly as if disturbed by movement I couldn't perceive. But 8 years of sensor readings had indicated flooding. 8 years of nightly humidity alarms at exactly 3:17 a.m., and I'd physically inspected the space multiple times, always finding it completely dry. I pulled up the archived camera footage, scrolling back through previous nights to see if this flooding phenomenon had been occurring all along. The recordings showed the same pattern. Dry corridor until 3:17 a.m., then sudden appearance of standing water and wet footprints forming in identical patterns, advancing down the corridor toward the camera, stopping directly beneath the lens. I scrolled back further. 1 week ago, same occurrence. 1 month ago, identical pattern. 6 months ago, the footage showed the same impossible flooding and the same invisible walker leaving wet footprints that matched my gait exactly. I checked footage from a year ago, then 2 years, then 3. The pattern held consistently every single night at 3:17 a.m., for as far back as the archived recordings extended. The sealed basement corridor had been flooding nightly with water that disappeared from physical inspection but remained visible in camera feeds, and someone had been walking through that water, leaving footprints that matched my own walking pattern for years before I'd even been hired at Whitmore. My radio crackled. "Control to Brennan. We're showing your GPS beacon in the basement level. Please confirm your location." I looked at my radio, then at my GPS tracking unit clipped to my belt. The device showed my position as B1 Corridor East, the sealed basement corridor. But I was sitting in the ground floor security booth, absolutely not in the basement. "Brennan here," I responded. "I'm in the control booth. GPS must be glitching." A pause, then. "Negative, Brennan. We have clear signal showing you in the basement corridor." "Are you sure of your location?" I looked around the control booth, confirming the familiar equipment, the monitoring screens, the coffee cup I'd set down 15 minutes ago. I was definitely in the control booth. But on camera B1 East, I could now see a figure standing in the flooded corridor, directly beneath the camera, looking up toward the lens. The figure wore a security uniform identical to mine, carried equipment matching my standard gear, and had a face I recognized from mirrors and ID photos and 1,000 casual glances at my own reflection. The figure in the basement was me. I stood up from my chair in the control booth, but the me on the camera feed didn't move. It continued standing in the flooded corridor, ankle deep in water that wasn't supposed to exist, staring up at the camera with an expression I couldn't quite read from this angle. My radio crackled again. Brennan, we need you to respond to your actual location. If you're experiencing equipment failure, we need to know immediately. I'm in the control booth, I said, but my voice sounded uncertain even to myself. I'm watching the basement camera feed showing someone else. Someone else? The dispatcher's voice carried professional concern. Brennan, we have no other personnel in the facility right now. It's just you on the night shift. I looked at the camera feed. The figure in the basement raised one hand and waved. The gesture clearly directed at the camera, at me, acknowledgement from one version of myself to another across some barrier I didn't understand. I'm coming down there, I said, making the decision impulsively, needing to physically verify what the cameras were showing. Going to check the basement in person. Negative, Brennan. That corridor is sealed. You don't have clearance to break the safety seals. But I was already moving, leaving the control booth, heading for the stairwell that accessed the basement level. I'd inspected this corridor before. I had authorization somewhere in my personnel file. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to reconcile the camera feed with physical reality. The basement access door was marked with warning tape and hazard notices, but it wasn't locked. I pulled it open and descended the concrete stairs, my flashlight cutting through darkness that felt thicker than it should, more resistant to illumination. The corridor at the bottom of the stairs was completely dry. I walked its length slowly, boots making hollow sounds on concrete that showed old water stains but no fresh moisture. The emergency lights were functioning, creating the same pools of illumination I'd seen in the camera feed, but there was no standing water, no wet footprints, no evidence of flooding beyond the historical damage from 8 years ago. I walked to the position where the camera was mounted and looked up. The lens was there, pointing down the corridor, capturing footage that apparently showed water and footprints that didn't exist in the physical space I was currently occupying. My radio crackled. Control to Brennan. We're still showing your GPS in the basement corridor. Can you confirm you're there? Confirmed, I said. I'm in the basement corridor. It's completely dry. The humidity sensors are definitely malfunctioning. Understood. But Brennan, we need you to explain something. We're looking at camera B1 East right now, and we can see you standing in what appears to be significant flooding. The water level looks at least 2 inches deep. Are you sure you're not experiencing any water intrusion? I looked down at my boots. Dry concrete, dusty and marked with old stains. No water whatsoever. There's no water here. The corridor is dry. A longer pause, then, Brennan, can you wave at the camera so we can confirm we're seeing you in real time? I raised my hand and waved at the camera lens above me. My radio crackled. Negative, Brennan. The person in the camera feed didn't move. They're still standing there in the water, not responding. Are you absolutely certain you're in the basement corridor? I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement temperature. I was standing in the corridor, waving at the camera, but the camera feed wasn't showing my movements. It was showing someone else, someone who looked exactly like me, standing in water that didn't exist, ignoring my actions as if we occupied completely separate realities. I pulled out my phone and opened the facility security app, accessing camera B1 East from my personal device. The feed showed exactly what dispatch was describing. A figure that looked like me standing in flooded corridor, ankle-deep in water, completely motionless despite my active movement in the actual space. But when I looked down, I noticed something that made my breath catch. My boots were wet, not slightly damp but soaked, water dripping from the leather, my socks absorbing moisture that was bleeding through despite the waterproof material. I was standing in a dry corridor with boots that showed clear evidence of having been submerged in standing water. I knelt down and touched the concrete floor, completely dry, dusty against my fingertips. But when I stood up again, my hand was wet, dripping with water that hadn't been there a moment ago. moisture that appeared on my skin despite the dry surface I'd just touched. The humidity alarm chimed. 3:17 a.m., 98% humidity, temperature 54 degrees. I could feel the water now cold and rising, creeping up my ankles despite the concrete floor remaining visibly dry beneath my feet. The contradiction was absolute. I could see dryness but feel flooding. Perceive dust but experience submersion. Occupy a space that was simultaneously bone dry and catastrophically waterlogged. On my phone, the camera feed showed the figure standing motionless in the flooded corridor. But now I realized the figure wasn't ignoring my movements. It was performing them exactly, synchronized perfectly, because the figure in the feed was me, and I was standing in the flooding that the physical corridor refused to acknowledge. I waded toward the stairs, though wading felt absurd when I could see no water to wade through, and climbed back to the ground floor. With each step, the sensation of submersion decreased, the phantom water draining away until by the time I reached the control booth, my boots felt dry again despite their waterlogged appearance. I checked camera B1 East. The corridor appeared dry once more, no standing water, no figure, just the familiar empty space marked with old stains. The footprints I'd left were still visible, though, wet impressions leading from the camera position to the stairs, documenting my patrol through flooding that existed in some layer of reality the cameras could capture but which physical presence couldn't quite access. My GPS beacon stabilized, showing me correctly positioned in the control booth. Dispatch called to confirm I'd returned to my station and to ask if I'd discovered the source of the sensor malfunctions. No source identified, I reported, following the script I'd learned over 6 years of nightly alarms. Corridor is dry. Sensors appear to be malfunctioning. Acknowledged, log it and continue your patrol. But every night at 3:17 a.m. the humidity alarm sounds. Every night camera B1 East shows flooding that physical inspection never confirms. And every night wet footprints form in that sealed corridor, walking the same route I walked during my patrols. Left by a version of me that exists in the flooding the facility refuses to acknowledge, but which the sensors have been accurately detecting for 8 years. I've stopped requesting maintenance on the humidity sensors. They're not malfunctioning. They're documenting a flooding that occurs in a layer of the building's reality that only becomes accessible at specific times under specific conditions to personnel whose physical presence somehow bridges the gap between what the sensors detect and what visual inspection reveals. Some corridors exist in multiple states simultaneously. Dry and flooded, empty and occupied, sealed and actively patrolled. And some security guards walk through both versions during their nightly rounds, leaving wet footprints in spaces that appear dry, conducting patrols that are simultaneously real and impossible. Recorded by cameras that capture flooding the human eye refuses to see, but which humidity sensors measure with perfect accuracy. Night after night after night. Story 8. The Emergency Alarm Test. The alarm test was scheduled for 2 a.m. on the first Tuesday of every month. A routine maintenance procedure I'd conducted 47 times during my 4 years working night security at Greenfield Psychiatric Hospital. The process was mechanical, procedural, something I could complete in my sleep. Activate the test sequence, verify that all alarm zones triggered correctly, confirm strobe lights functioning, silence the system, log completion. 3 minutes, start to finish. Simple, predictable, boring in the way that institutional routines become after sufficient repetition. But the October test didn't stop. I initiated the sequence at exactly 2 a.m., pressing the test button on the main alarm panel and watching the system cycle through its verification protocol. The klaxons began their familiar wail, alternating between high and low tones in the pattern designed to alert staff to emergency conditions. The strobe lights activated throughout the facility, white flashes pulsing in rhythm with the audio alarms. Zone 1, clear. Zone 2, clear. Zone 3, clear. All 12 zones reported normal function, the panel display showing green confirmation indicators for each section of the building. I pressed the silence button. Nothing happened. The alarms continued wailing, the strobes continued flashing, the system maintaining its emergency alert status despite my command to terminate the test sequence. I pressed the silence button again, holding it for 5 seconds as the manual specified for forced system reset. The alarms continued. I tried the master override switch, the emergency cutoff, the individual zone disable controls. Nothing responded. The alarm system had activated correctly but now refused all commands to shut down, as if the test had transformed into an actual emergency that couldn't be canceled. The strobes were creating a disorienting visual effect, the facility alternating between harsh illumination and relative darkness at 2-second intervals. During the flashes, I could see down the corridor outside the security office, the patient ward visible through the reinforced glass doors. During the darkness between flashes, the corridor disappeared into shadow, then reappeared with each subsequent strobe pulse. Flash, empty corridor, closed patient doors, standard nighttime configuration. Dark, 2 seconds of shadow. Flash, the corridor appeared again, but something was different. The patient doors were open. Dark. Flash, patient standing in the corridor. I stared through the glass doors, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what should have been possible. The patient ward was secured at night, individual rooms locked, residents contained for their safety and the safety of staff. But during each strobe flash, I could see them clearly. 12 patients standing in the corridor, positioned at regular intervals, all facing upward toward the ceiling as if watching something I couldn't perceive. They stood completely motionless, frozen in identical postures, heads tilted back, arms at their sides, maintaining their positions with mechanical precision. When the darkness came between flashes, I couldn't see them at all. But each time the strobes pulsed, they were there, unchanged, still staring upward at the ceiling tiles. I grabbed my radio. Security to nurses' station. We have patients out of their rooms on Ward B requesting immediate assistance. No response. The radio produced only static, the alarm system apparently interfering with communication frequencies. I tried my cell phone. No signal. The landline on my desk. No dial tone. Every communication system was down except for the alarm that wouldn't stop and the strobes that kept revealing impossible tableau of patients who shouldn't have been able to leave their locked rooms. I moved toward the ward doors, intending to verify in person what the strobe flashes were showing. But as I approached, I realized something that made me stop moving. Between the strobe pulses and the 2-second intervals of darkness, I could hear breathing, not normal breathing, synchronized breathing. 12 people inhaling and exhaling in perfect unison, their respiration timed with mechanical precision, creating a collective rhythm that filled the dark intervals between light pulses. Flash patients standing motionless, staring upward. Dark, synchronized breathing, inhale and exhale perfectly timed. Flash patients still motionless, but now I could see their eyes. All of them were staring at the same point on the ceiling, their attention focused with absolute concentration on something I couldn't see, even when the strobes revealed the ceiling tiles clearly. I counted the patients during the next flash. 12 figures equally spaced down the corridor, all in identical postures. Dark. Flash. 11 figures. The patient who'd been standing closest to the nurse's station was gone, vanished during the 2-second interval of darkness, leaving an empty space in the pattern. My heart rate accelerated. I counted again during the next flash, hoping I'd miscounted, that the strobe effect had created an optical illusion. 11 patients. The space where the 12th had been standing remained empty. Dark. Flash. 10 patients. Another figure missing. This time from the middle of the corridor pattern. The remaining patients maintained their positions, still staring upward, still breathing in perfect synchronization during the dark intervals. I backed away from the ward doors, my professional training warring with instinctive fear. I should have been entering the ward, accounting for the missing patients, following protocols for containment. But something about their synchronized breathing and their collective upward gaze and their systematic disappearance during the dark intervals suggested this wasn't a standard security situation. Flash. 9 patients. Dark, synchronized breathing, slightly louder now, as if the remaining patients were compensating for the missing voices. Flash. 8 patients. The gaps in the corridor pattern becoming more pronounced. I tried the alarm panel again, cycling through every control sequence I knew, attempting emergency overrides that should have forced the system into reset. Nothing worked. The klaxons continued their wailing, the strobes continued their flashing, and with each cycle of light and darkness, another patient vanished from the corridor. Flash. 7 patients. Flash. 6 patients. Flash. 5 patients. And now I could see that the remaining figures were no longer just staring at the ceiling. They were smiling, their faces showing expressions of profound satisfaction, as if they were witnessing something wonderful in the space above them that only they could perceive. I checked my watch. 2:08 a.m. The alarm test had been running for 8 minutes, 6 minutes beyond the standard completion time. The logbook on my desk would need an explanation for the extended duration. A rational accounting for what was happening. But how do you document patients disappearing in synchronized intervals while staring at ceilings during an alarm test that won't stop? Flash. 4 patients. Dark. The breathing was much louder now, filling the intervals between strobes with sound that seemed too voluminous to come from only 4 people, as if the disappeared patients were still contributing to the collective respiration despite their invisible status. Flash. 3 patients, and I realized I recognized one of them. James Morton, a long-term resident with catatonic schizophrenia who rarely showed any voluntary movement. But here he was, standing with perfect posture, smiling upward at the ceiling, participating in whatever synchronized event was unfolding during this endless alarm test. Flash. 2 patients. Flash. 1 patient. James Morton alone in the corridor, still staring upward, his smile wider now, almost ecstatic. Dark, the breathing continued at full volume. 12 sets of lungs inhaling and exhaling in perfect rhythm despite 11 of the breathers being invisible. Flash. The corridor was empty. James Morton had vanished like the others, leaving only the collective breathing filling the darkness between strobe pulses. I stood frozen, watching the empty corridor alternate between illumination and shadow, the alarm continuing its wail. The strobes flashing on vacant space where 12 patients had been standing 8 minutes ago. Then the breathing stopped. The silence between strobe pulses became absolute, no sound except the klaxons and my own ragged breathing. The corridor remained empty. Patient rooms still showing their doors open, no movement, no indication of where the residents had gone. The alarm system shut off at 2:12 a.m. exactly 12 minutes after the test had begun. The silence was jarring after the sustained audio assault, and the sudden absence of strobe flashes left the facility in standard night lighting that seemed dim by comparison. I entered the patient ward immediately, conducting a room-by-room search. Every patient was in their room, doors closed and locked as they should have been. Residents sleeping peacefully in their beds as if they'd never left. James Morton was in his usual catatonic state, lying motionless, showing no signs of the animated participation I'd witnessed in the corridor. I counted. 12 patients, all accounted for, all properly secured. The nurses arrived at 2:20 a.m. responding to my delayed radio call once communications were restored. They reported nothing unusual, no awareness that patients had been out of their rooms, no explanation for how the alarm test had extended to 12 minutes or why the system had refused shutdown commands. I filed the incident report with careful language. Monthly alarm test conducted 2:12 a.m. System experienced temporary malfunction preventing normal termination sequence. All zones functioned correctly, no safety issues identified. Recommend maintenance review of silence controls. But I didn't document the patients in the corridor, their synchronized breathing, their systematic disappearance during the dark intervals between strobe flashes. Those observations didn't fit the format of standard security reporting, didn't align with the institutional language of routine maintenance procedures. The November alarm test is scheduled for next Tuesday at 2:00 a.m. I've been reviewing the manual, memorizing every shutdown procedure, preparing for what I hope will be a normal 3-minute test that terminates on command. But I've also been watching the patients more carefully during my nightly rounds, looking for signs of that synchronized breathing, that collective upward gaze, that systematic coordination that suggested they were participating in something that occurred during alarm tests, but which official protocols would never acknowledge or document. Some emergency systems don't just test alarm functionality, they test something else, something that requires strobe-lit darkness and sonic disruption and the temporary dissolution of the boundaries between secured patients and open corridors. And some security guards witness those tests without ever quite understanding what's being measured, what's being verified, what's being confirmed about the facility's readiness for emergencies that have nothing to do with fire or medical crisis, but which require patients to stand in corridors during the darkness between light pulses, breathing in perfect synchronization while staring at ceilings that hold something the strobes will never quite reveal. Story 9. The security camera glitch. The shadow was moving backward through solid walls when I noticed the camera glitch at 4:47 a.m. And I only noticed because everything else in frame 17 had frozen completely. Motionless corridor, static timestamp, image locked in perfect stillness except for the shadow that continued moving in reverse through architecture that should have blocked its passage. I'd been reviewing the overnight footage as part of my morning routine before shift end at Lakeside Psychiatric Institute. 8 hours of recorded surveillance condensed into a 40-minute high-speed playback. My eyes scanning for anomalies, incidents, anything requiring documentation. After 3 years of watching these recordings, the process had become mechanical. My attention only engaging when motion or change disrupted the expected patterns. Camera 17, East Wing Corridor B, showed a standard view. Empty hallway, closed patient doors. Overhead lighting creating the usual pools of illumination and shadow. The timestamp read 03:42:18 and nothing moved in the frame, except the shadow. It traveled backward along the corridor wall, moving from right to left in the reverse of normal walking direction. But more impossibly, it passed through the solid wall that terminated the corridor, continuing its backward journey through space that shouldn't have existed beyond that architectural barrier. I stopped the playback and rewound to the beginning of the anomaly. At 03:42:15, camera 17 showed a normal corridor scene. At 03:42:16, the image froze, not the recording stopping, but the physical space captured by the camera becoming completely static, as if time itself had paused within that specific frame. But the shadow continued moving, unaffected by whatever had frozen the rest of the scene, traveling backward through the motionless corridor at a steady walking pace. I watched it make 3 complete passes, entering from the left side of frame, moving backward to the right, passing through the solid wall, then reappearing from the left to repeat the journey. The pattern continued for exactly 3 minutes until 3:45:15, when the corridor unfroze and resumed normal appearance. I checked the other 17 cameras. All showed standard overnight footage, empty corridors, sleeping patients, routine facility documentation. Only camera 17 displayed the frozen time phenomenon and the backward-moving shadow. I pulled up camera 17's maintenance logs. No reported malfunctions, no recent service, and no indication of technical problems that might produce frozen frames or shadow artifacts. The smell hit me when I went to inspect the corridor in person. Ozone, sharp and distinctive like the air after a lightning strike. The East Wing should have smelled like institutional cleaner and recycled air conditioning. Instead, it carried that electric scent that suggested recent energy discharge. Something releasing electromagnetic force in a space designed for mundane psychiatric treatment. I walked the corridor slowly, checking the walls where the shadow had passed through. Solid construction, no doorways or openings, no logical explanation for anything moving through the barrier. The wall felt normal under my hand, slightly cool, textured with standard institutional paint, completely solid. But the ozone smell was strongest exactly where the shadow had passed through, concentrated at the point of impossible transition between corridor and whatever space existed beyond the architectural boundary. I returned to the security office and continued reviewing footage. The next occurrence appeared on camera 17 at 04:12:33. Same frozen time effect, same backward-moving shadow, same 3-minute duration. Then again at 04:38:47. The pattern was consistent, repeating roughly every half hour throughout the remaining night footage. I began reviewing archived recordings from previous nights. The phenomenon had been occurring for weeks, visible in camera 17's footage, but apparently unnoticed during standard playback, because the frozen time effect was subtle enough to miss during high-speed review. The shadow had been making its backward journeys through solid walls for at least a month, possibly longer, traveling through frozen moments that occurred with regular frequency. I was preparing to file a technical malfunction report when I noticed something that made my breath catch. During the most recent occurrence at 04:38:47, the frozen corridor wasn't completely static. One element showed motion besides the backward-moving shadow. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was a reflection in the corridor's floor wax. And that reflection showed movement, a figure sitting in a chair, occasionally shifting position, apparently watching the frozen corridor from some vantage point the camera couldn't directly capture. The figure's posture was familiar. The equipment belt, the uniform details visible in the distorted floor reflection. The way the person sat with slight forward lean while observing something intently. The reflection was me, sitting in my security office chair, watching camera 17's feed. Visible in the floor's polished surface during the frozen time intervals when I shouldn't have been captured in that camera's field of view at all. I looked down at the actual floor beneath my chair. No reflective surface, just standard institutional carpet that couldn't possibly cast the mirror-like reflection visible in camera 17's footage. But there I was in the recording, reflected in impossible floor surfaces, watching the frozen corridor while the shadow moved backward through walls, both of us somehow existing in the same frame despite being in physically separate locations. I checked the current live feed from camera 17. The corridor appeared normal. No frozen time, no backward shadow, no floor reflection showing my security office. Standard nighttime appearance, nothing unusual. But I could still smell ozone, stronger now, as if the phenomenon were intensifying, bleeding through from whatever state of reality it occupied into the normal operational space of the facility. My shift ended at 6 a.m., but I stayed an extra hour, continuing to review footage, trying to understand the pattern. The frozen time intervals were getting longer. What started as 3 minutes had extended to 5 minutes, then 7, the duration increasing with each occurrence as if the effect were strengthening, becoming more pronounced. And in each frozen interval, my reflection appeared more clearly in the impossible floor surfaces, showing me sitting in my chair, watching the monitor, trapped in the footage of the very scene I was reviewing. The morning shift guard arrived at 7 a.m. I briefed him on the camera glitch, showing him the frozen time footage, pointing out the backward-moving shadow. "I don't see any glitch," he said, watching the playback I'd queued up. "Just looks like a normal empty corridor to me." I looked at the screen. He was right. The footage played normally, showing standard corridor views with no frozen time, no shadow, no floor reflections. The anomaly had vanished from the recording as if it had never existed. But I'd seen it. I'd documented timestamps, made notes, verified the pattern across multiple occurrences. The footage had shown frozen time and impossible shadows just minutes ago. "Check camera 17 throughout the day," I told him. "Let me know if you see anything unusual." He nodded with the polite dismissiveness of someone humoring a colleague at the end of a long night shift. I've been reviewing camera 17's footage obsessively now, watching for the frozen time intervals that only I seem able to perceive. They're occurring more frequently, every 20 minutes, than every 15. The backward-moving shadow making its repeated journeys through solid walls while my reflection sits in impossible floor surfaces, watching the same footage I'm watching, trapped in recursive observation loops. Last night, during the frozen interval at 03:42:18, I looked down at the actual floor beneath my chair and saw it had become reflective, polished to a mirror surface that shouldn't exist on institutional carpet. And in that reflection, I could see camera 17's corridor frozen in time above me, the shadow moving backward through walls, and myself sitting in my chair watching a monitor that showed me sitting in my chair watching a monitor. Infinite regression of observation documented by cameras that capture more layers of reality than their technical specifications were designed to record. Some glitches don't indicate equipment failure. They reveal moments when surveillance systems accidentally document the recursive nature of observation itself, capturing watching watchers in frozen intervals where shadows move backward and floors become mirrors and security guards find themselves trapped in footage of themselves watching footage of themselves in electromagnetic loops that smell like ozone and defy the linear progression of institutional time. Story 10. The Silent Wing. The intercom call from Wing C came through at exactly 1:33 a.m., the same time it had called every night for the past 8 months, requesting a welfare check on a section of Riverside Psychiatric Hospital that had been closed and emptied of patients 6 years before I was hired. "Security, please respond to Wing C for patient welfare check." The voice was neutral, professional, carrying the measured tone of someone making a routine request. It came through the facility's internal communication system with perfect clarity, as if originating from an active nursing station rather than an abandoned wing that had been sealed after budget cuts forced the consolidation of patient services. During my first week on night shift, I'd responded to the call, walking to Wing C with my flashlight and security keys, ready to investigate what I assumed was a malfunction in the intercom system. Some crossed wire allowing old recorded messages to play through speakers in the closed section. The wing was empty, as it should have been. Dust covered the floors. The patient rooms sat vacant with their doors propped open. The nursing station showed no signs of recent occupation. The intercom panel was powered down, disconnected according to the facility administrator, who'd explained that all electrical systems in Wing C had been deactivated to save operational costs. Yet the call continued coming through every night at 1:33 a.m., requesting welfare checks on patients who didn't exist in a wing that wasn't operational. After the first month, I'd learned to simply acknowledge the call with a radio response. Security responding. Wing C welfare check complete. No issues identified. The acknowledgement seemed to satisfy whatever automated system was generating the requests, and the calls would stop until the next night. Then 3 weeks ago, I made the mistake of speaking back through the intercom. I'd been conducting my standard patrol of Wing C, verifying that the sealed section remained secure when I passed the disconnected nursing station intercom. On impulse, I pressed the call button and spoke. "This is Security Officer Daniel Merrick. Wing C is clear, no patients in residence. Please discontinue welfare check requests." I'd used my full name without thinking, the formal identification that had been drilled into me during security training. The intercom was dead, powered down, incapable of transmitting. I was speaking to inactive equipment in an empty wing, but the intercom crackled in response, and a voice I hadn't heard in 7 years replied, "Daniel, is that really you, son?" My father's voice, unmistakable, carrying the slight rasp he'd developed during his final illness, the careful enunciation he'd maintained even when the cancer made breathing difficult. He died 7 years ago, his last words to me spoken in a hospital room 300 miles from where I now stood, listening to his voice emerge from a deactivated intercom in an abandoned psychiatric wing. "Dad?" I whispered, my hand still on the call button, my mind struggling to reconcile what I was hearing with what should have been possible. "I've been trying to reach you, Daniel. Every night, same time. But you never answered directly before. You just sent those radio responses, treating me like some automated system. How is this possible? Wing C isn't as empty as you think. Some of us never left when they closed this section. We've been here waiting for someone to acknowledge us properly, to respond with full identification so we knew who we were talking to." I released the call button and backed away from the nursing station, my professional training warring with the impossible reality of having a conversation with my deceased father through equipment that had no power supply. But his voice continued without my pressing the call button. "The welfare checks are real, Daniel. We need someone to verify that we're still here, still maintaining our presence in this wing, even though official records show it as empty. You're the night security, that's your job. To confirm what exists in the facility during the hours when everyone else has gone home. Dad, you're dead. This isn't real. I'm dead to the outside world, yes, but in here, in Wing C, some of us found a different kind of continuation. The patients who were housed here during my time. We were forgotten when the wing closed, our treatment records archived, our presence erased from active census. But we couldn't leave, Daniel. We had nowhere else to go. You were never a patient here. You died in a cancer ward across the state." A long pause, then. "Are you certain about that?" "Check the archived records, Daniel." Patient Donald Merrick, admitted to Wing C for end-of-life psychiatric care when the cancer became terminal. I spent my final 6 weeks here, not in that hospital room you remember visiting. Your mother didn't want you to know, didn't want you to remember me in a psychiatric facility. So she created different memories for you, cleaner memories, hospital rooms instead of this wing. I pulled out my security tablet and accessed the facility archives, searching for patient records from 7 years ago. The database was sluggish, retrieving old files from backup storage, but eventually the results loaded. Patient Donald Merrick, admitted to Wing C on March 3rd, transferred for end-stage palliative care with psychiatric support. Deceased April 18th, room 312. I walked to room 312 in the abandoned wing. The door was open, the room empty like all the others, dust covering every surface. But on the wall above where the bed would have been positioned, I could see a faint outline in the paint, a rectangular shadow where something had hung for a long time before being removed, protecting that section from the fading and discoloration that had affected the rest of the wall. A photograph frame, perhaps, or a get-well card, something personal that had marked this as an occupied room before the wing closed and all evidence of habitation was cleared away. "You visited me here, Daniel, room 312. You sat beside my bed during my final week, but you were young, only 19, and the grief was too much. Your mind rewrote the setting, placed us in a cleaner facility, created memories that were easier to process." I sat down on the floor of room 312, my back against the wall, trying to reconcile two competing sets of memories. The ones I'd carried for 7 years of my father dying in a standard hospital, and these new recollections surfacing like photographs developing in solution, showing me sitting in this very room, holding his hand while he struggled with pain that required both medical and psychiatric intervention. "The welfare check requests," my father's voice continued through the wing's intercom system, "are our way of maintaining existence. Every night at 1:33 a.m., the time I died, we call for verification that we're still here, still occupying this space even though official reality has forgotten us. Most nights you just send a radio acknowledgement and that's enough to sustain us, but tonight you used your full name, established direct connection, allowed me to speak with you properly. What do you want from me? Just acknowledgement, son. Recognition that Wing C isn't truly empty, that the patients who died here didn't fully depart, that we maintain a kind of presence that requires periodic verification. The welfare checks aren't malfunctions. They're necessary confirmations that we still exist in whatever form we've taken since the wing closed. I've been answering the 1:33 a.m. calls differently since that night. Instead of radio acknowledgments, I go to Wing C in person, press the intercom button in the nursing station, and respond. "Security Officer Daniel Merrick acknowledging welfare check request. Wing C residents confirmed present." The response varies each night. Sometimes it's my father's voice thanking me for the confirmation. Sometimes it's other voices, patients I never knew but who appreciate the recognition that they haven't been completely erased by administrative decisions to close their wing and consolidate services. The calls have changed in quality over the past 3 weeks. They're fainter now, as if the voices are growing distant, or perhaps as if they're growing closer in some way that makes them harder to hear through conventional communication systems. The intercom crackles more, the words sometimes overlapping, multiple voices speaking simultaneously in patterns that suggest group communication rather than individual calls. Last night, the welfare check request came at 1:33 a.m. as expected, but the voice was barely audible, a whisper that I could only partially make out. "Daniel, welfare check, room 312, please verify." I went to Wing C immediately, but instead of going to the nursing station, I walked directly to room 312. The door was closed this time, though I was certain I'd left it propped open like all the others during my previous patrol. I opened the door and found the room occupied, not physically, not in any way that involved solid matter or conventional presence, but occupied nonetheless. The air felt different, heavier, as if multiple people were breathing in the space. The dust patterns on the floor showed disturbances that suggested foot traffic, furniture positions, the normal wear of a room being actively used despite its abandoned status. And on the wall above where the bed would have been, the rectangular outline had become darker, more defined, as if the shadow of whatever had once hung there was intensifying, becoming more pronounced rather than fading with time. I pressed the intercom button on my radio. "Security Officer Daniel Merrick verifying welfare check. Wing C, room 312, presence confirmed, residents acknowledged." The whisper came not through my radio but directly into the room, surrounding me from all directions. "Thank you, son. We're still here. We'll always be here at 1:33 a.m. waiting for someone who remembers to verify that forgotten places don't become completely empty, that closed wings maintain their populations even after official records show them as vacant. I've filed no formal reports about Wing C. There's no institutional language for documenting that an abandoned psychiatric wing maintains a population of patients who died before the closure, but who continue requiring nightly welfare checks from security staff who happen to share blood relationships with the residents. The calls continue at 1:33 a.m. I continue responding in person, walking to Wing C, confirming presence in rooms that archives show as occupied during their final operational years. Each night the voices are slightly fainter, slightly closer, as if they're transitioning to some state where conventional communication becomes less necessary, because the distance between their existence and mine is narrowing. Last night, when I entered room 312, I could see my father. Not clearly, not solidly, but present in a way that suggested his form was being reconstructed from memory and shadow and the accumulated dust of an abandoned wing. He smiled and gestured to the space beside his bed, inviting me to sit in a chair that existed only in the overlap between his persistent presence and my willingness to acknowledge it. I sat down, and we talked about everything we never finished discussing before he died. My life, my choices, my job providing security in the same facility where he spent his final weeks. He's proud of the work I do, the nightly welfare checks that confirm existence for residents who've been forgotten by everyone except the security officer who acknowledges them by full name at precisely the time when one of them stopped breathing 7 years ago but never quite finished dying. Some wings close administratively but remain operationally active in layers of facility existence that only become accessible during specific hours to staff members whose personal connections to the residents create bridges between official vacancy and persistent presence. And some welfare check requests aren't system malfunctions. They're legitimate calls from populations that continue requiring verification, confirmation that they still exist in the institutional memory of places that deleted them from active census but couldn't quite erase them from the architecture's electromagnetic persistence and the recognition of security guards who share their names and blood and memories of rooms that are simultaneously empty and occupied, vacant and vital, closed and somehow still calling for help at exactly 1:33 a.m. every night. Story 11. The Incident Report. The blood was still fresh on my uniform when I sat down to write the incident report at 4:15 a.m., documenting the violent patient outbreak that had occurred 30 minutes earlier in the secure ward of Northfield Psychiatric Hospital. An event that had left 2 staff members injured and 1 patient requiring emergency medical restraint. I'd been present for the entire incident. Patient Martin Hayes, 43, diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia with violent ideation, had become agitated during routine medication distribution, striking Nurse Jennifer Walsh and pushing orderly Tom Bennett against the medication cart before security staff could intervene and apply emergency restraint protocols. The sequence was clear in my mind. Hayes attacking Walsh first, knocking her to the floor where she struck her head on the door frame, then turning on Bennett, who'd attempted to intervene. I'd arrived within 30 seconds, helping to safely restrain Hayes before he could cause additional harm. Walsh sustained a head laceration requiring 3 stitches. Bennett had bruised ribs and a sprained wrist. Hayes was sedated and secured in observation. I typed the incident report with methodical precision, documenting timeline, involved parties, injuries sustained, actions taken. Standard procedure required completion within 1 hour of any violent incident, filed with administration before shift end. Incident report, number 2847. Date, November 8, 2023. Time, 03:45 a.m. Location, Ward B medication station, involved parties. Patient Martin Hayes. Nurse Jennifer Walsh, injured. Orderly Tom Bennett, injured. Security officer Daniel Carter, reporting. I filled in the details, describing the sequence of events, the specific injuries, the restraint procedures applied. I reviewed the text carefully before submitting, ensuring accuracy and completeness. Then I noticed something wrong with the injured parties list. The form now read, Nurse Jennifer Walsh, injured. Orderly Tom Bennett, deceased. Security Officer Daniel Carter, reporting deceased. Tom Bennett was listed as deceased, but I'd just helped him walk to the first aid station 15 minutes ago. He'd been conscious, alert, complaining about his bruised ribs, but definitely alive when I left him with the attending nurse. I deleted deceased and retyped injured, assuming I'd made a typo in my initial entry. But when I tabbed to the next field, the text revised itself again. Nurse Jennifer Walsh, deceased. Orderly Tom Bennett, injured. Security Officer Daniel Carter, reporting. My hands froze on the keyboard. Walsh was definitely not dead. I'd watched the medical staff clean and bandage her head laceration. She'd been coherent, joking about her clumsiness, absolutely alive. I tried deleting the entire injured parties section and retyping it from scratch. The moment I completed the entry, the text shifted. Nurse Jennifer Walsh, injured. Orderly Tom Bennett, injured. Security Officer Daniel Carter, deceased. My own name, listed as deceased. I stared at the screen, trying to understand what kind of software malfunction could produce this specific type of error. Random glitches would generate garbage text, not coherent status changes, systematically labeling people as dead. I checked the incident report template file, thinking perhaps it contained corrupted data. But the template was clean, showing only blank fields waiting to be populated. I started over with a completely new report using different document software, typing carefully to ensure no input errors. The narrative section completed normally, but when I reached the involved parties list, the same phenomenon occurred. No matter what I typed, the system revised one person's status from injured to deceased, cycling through the three of us in a pattern I couldn't control. I decided to verify everyone's actual status before continuing. I walked to the first aid station where Tom Bennett was receiving treatment. He sat on the examination table, wincing as the nurse wrapped his ribs. "Tom, how are you feeling?" He looked up with a pained smile. "Been better, bruised but intact. Haze got me pretty good. Definitely alive, definitely not deceased." I went to find Jennifer Walsh, locating her in the staff break room with a bandage covering the stitched laceration on her forehead. "Jennifer, checking in on your status. I'm fine, Daniel, headache and wounded pride, but I'll survive. The stitches are tiny, won't even scar. Definitely alive, definitely not deceased." I returned to the security office more confused than before. Both staff members were provably alive, yet the incident report kept insisting one of us was dead. I tried calling IT support, but at 4:30 a.m. no technical staff were available. I sent an email describing the software issue and decided to complete the report by hand, using the paper backup forms we kept for system failures. But the paper form showed the same phenomenon. I wrote, "Nurse Jennifer Walsh, injured," in clear handwriting. The ink shifted on the page, letters rearranging themselves. Nurse Jennifer Walsh, deceased. I watched it happen in real time, my handwritten text transforming itself, ink moving across paper like liquid, reforming into words I hadn't written. I tried again with Tom Bennett's entry. The same transformation occurred moments after I completed writing, the word injured dissolving and reforming as deceased. When I wrote my own name and status, I watched the word reporting liquefy and reshape itself. Security Officer Daniel Carter, deceased. The form was insisting I was dead, had died during the incident, despite my obvious presence sitting here writing the report. I could feel my pulse, my breathing, my solid physical existence. I was absolutely not deceased. I abandoned the paper form and pulled up the digital report again, studying the pattern more carefully. The system cycled the deceased designation through the three of us, but it never marked all three as dead simultaneously. 1 deceased, 2 injured. Always that ratio, but the specific victim changed with each revision. I began documenting the different versions, taking screenshots of each variation. Version 1, Walsh deceased, Bennett injured, Carter injured. Version 2, Walsh injured, Bennett deceased, Carter injured. Version 3, Walsh injured, Bennett injured, Carter deceased. The pattern repeated, cycling through the three possibilities as if the system couldn't determine which of us had actually died during the incident, but knew with certainty that someone had. I checked the surveillance footage, thinking perhaps I'd misremembered the sequence, that the violent outbreak had been worse than I recalled. But the video confirmed my memory. Hayes attacking Walsh and Bennett, both sustaining injuries but remaining conscious, both receiving medical treatment, both walking under their own power to the first aid station. No one had died. The incident was serious but not fatal. Yet the incident report insisted on documenting a death, systematically cycling through the 3 staff members involved. Unable to settle on which of us was supposed to be deceased, but certain that one of us was. I submitted version 1 to administration, documenting Walsh as deceased even though I knew it was inaccurate, hoping the administrative review would catch the obvious error. At 5:30 a.m., I received a response from the night administrator. Incident report 2847 received and reviewed. We're very sorry for the loss of Nurse Walsh. Please ensure all proper notifications are completed before shift end. Counseling services will be available for staff affected by this tragedy. I immediately called the administrator's office. This is Carter in security. There's an error in incident report 2847. Nurse Walsh isn't dead. She's in the staff break room right now. A long pause, then. Officer Carter, I understand this is difficult, but we need to face reality. Nurse Walsh sustained fatal injuries during the patient attack. She was pronounced deceased at 04:05 a.m. I know you worked closely with her, but denial won't help the grieving process. I'm telling you she's alive. I spoke with her 20 minutes ago. Officer Carter, I'm going to recommend you speak with our crisis counselor. Traumatic incidents can cause confusion and dissociative responses. Please report to employee services before your shift ends. I hung up and ran to the staff break room. Empty. The coffee cup Jennifer had been holding sat on the table, still half full, but she was gone. I found Tom Bennett in the hallway. Tom, have you seen Jennifer? He looked at me with confusion and concern. Daniel, what are you talking about? Jennifer died this morning. We all got the notification an hour ago. Are you okay? No, I saw her. We talked. She had stitches in her forehead. Tom took my arm gently. Daniel, you need to sit down. You've been under a lot of stress. Jennifer sustained a fatal head injury when Hayes pushed her. She never regained consciousness. You were there when it happened. You helped with the emergency response. I pulled away from him, my mind reeling. I had memories of talking to Jennifer alive, and equally vivid memories of watching her die, both sets coexisting impossibly, competing for status as objective reality. I returned to my security office and opened the incident report again. It now showed only one version, no longer cycling. Nurse Jennifer Walsh, deceased. Orderly Tom Bennett, injured security officer Daniel Carter reporting. The form had stabilized, settling on Walsh as the deceased party. And my memories were stabilizing too, the version where she survived fading like a dream, being replaced by the official narrative where she'd sustained fatal injuries during the attack. I checked my phone, looking at my text message history. There was no conversation with Jennifer tonight, though I clearly remembered texting her to confirm she was okay. The message thread ended yesterday. Our last exchange about scheduling and shift coverage, nothing from tonight. The incident report had cycled through possibilities, testing different outcomes, and reality had conformed to whichever version the system finally settled on. Or perhaps reality had been uncertain, multiple outcomes existing simultaneously, and the act of documentation had collapsed those possibilities into a single definitive timeline. I'm writing this addition to the incident report now, documenting what I experienced, how the form cycled through different versions of events before settling on the one where Jennifer Walsh died during the patient attack. But I know this addendum will disappear, will be edited out of the final record because administrative systems don't accommodate narratives about reality being uncertain or documentation changing outcomes. By the time my shift ends, I'll remember only the official version. Jennifer Walsh died at 04:05 a.m. from head trauma sustained during a violent patient incident. I was there when it happened. I helped with the emergency response. I filed the incident report documenting her death. The fact that I also remember her surviving, receiving stitches, drinking coffee in the break room. Those memories are already fading, being overwritten by the official narrative, the version that the incident report settled on after cycling through all the possibilities. Some reports don't just document what happened, they determine what happened, cycling through potential outcomes until reality conforms to whichever version the documentation finally accepts as definitive. And some security officers learn that being the person who files the report means bearing witness to all the possible outcomes simultaneously, watching the system test different realities before choosing which one becomes official history. The next incident report I file might cycle to the version where my name appears under deceased. And when it does, reality will conform. Memories will revise, and someone else will sit at this desk documenting my death while simultaneously remembering a version of events where I survived. Both timelines coexisting briefly before the official record collapses them into whichever outcome the system decides to preserve. Story 12. The Patient Transfer Request. The transfer request appeared in my inbox at 2:44 a.m. with the subject line, Urgent Patient Transfer, Authorization Code read 7. And I knew immediately something was wrong because Westbrook Psychiatric Hospital hadn't used Authorization Code read 7 in over a decade, not since the administrative restructuring that redesigned all our emergency protocols. I opened the email expecting to find a phishing attempt or some kind of system error. Instead, I found a perfectly formatted transfer request, complete with all the required documentation fields, official letterhead, and administrative signatures that appeared genuine. Transfer request number 4429. Patient name Daniel Carter, current location Westbrook Psychiatric Hospital, Ward C transfer. Destination the classified reason for transfer. Specialized treatment requirements beyond facility capabilities. Authorization level Red 7 approved by Director Patricia Hoffman. Immediate action required Daniel Carter, that was my name. But I wasn't a patient. I was the night security supervisor sitting at my desk reviewing routine administrative emails during the quietest hours of my shift. I checked the patient registry, searching for any Daniel Carter in our current census. No results. I expanded the search to include discharged patients, archived records, even pending admissions. Nothing. No patient by that name had ever been housed at Westbrook according to our database. Yet the transfer request was thorough, including medical history summaries, treatment protocols, medication schedules, and behavioral assessments, all documenting a patient who didn't exist in any official registry. I tried to delete the email, but my computer froze the moment I pressed the delete key. The screen went dark, then illuminated again, showing a live video feed that I didn't recognize from any of our security cameras. The feed showed a hospital corridor brightly lit, institutional in design but not matching any section of Westbrook's layout. A gurney rolled down the corridor, pushed by an attendant wearing medical transport uniform. As the gurney approached the camera angle, I could see the attendant's identification badge clearly. The badge showed my face, my name, Daniel Carter, patient transport specialist. But I was sitting in my security office wearing my standard guard uniform, watching this impossible video feed showing me in a different role, pushing a gurney through corridors that didn't exist in any building I recognized. I tried to close the video feed, but my keyboard and mouse had become non-responsive. The only functioning element was the video itself, which continued playing, showing the gurney's progress through multiple corridors, past nursing stations, through security checkpoints where other staff nodded recognition to the attendant who wore my face. The gurney reached an elevator. The attendant, me, but not me, pressed the call button and waited patiently. When the doors opened, he rolled the gurney inside and the camera angle shifted to show the elevator's interior view. On the gurney lay a patient covered with a standard white sheet, face visible, eyes closed, apparently sedated or unconscious. I couldn't see the patient's features clearly from the camera angle, but something about the body proportions, the visible hair color, the general build looked disturbingly familiar. The elevator doors closed and my computer screen returned to normal, showing my standard desktop and the transfer request email still open, still demanding immediate action. I grabbed my radio. Control to all units, I need a facility-wide verification. Anyone seen unusual patient transport activity in the past 10 minutes? The responses came back negative. No transport activity, no gurney movements, no patients being relocated during the night hours when such transfers would be unusual anyway. I checked our patient census carefully. Every resident was accounted for, documented in their assigned rooms. No one missing or being transferred. Yet the transfer request remained in my inbox, insisting that patient Daniel Carter required immediate relocation to an undisclosed destination for specialized treatment. I tried replying to the email, asking for clarification, requesting verification of the patient's identity. The moment I clicked send, my computer locked again and the video feed returned. This time the camera showed a patient room. Sparse, clean institutional furniture arranged in standard psychiatric facility configuration. The gurney had arrived at its destination and the attendant was transferring the patient from the transport gurney to the room's permanent bed. As the attendant arranged the patient on the bed, the camera angle finally provided a clear view of the patient's face. It was me. I was watching myself transfer myself from a gurney to a bed, conducting patient relocation procedures while simultaneously being the patient being relocated, both roles occupying the same video feed in a temporal and spatial relationship that violated every logical principle. The patient me on the bed opened his eyes and looked directly at the camera. His expression was calm, accepting, as if this relocation were expected, routine, something he'd prepared for. The attendant me completed the transfer documentation, hung a chart at the foot of the bed and exited the room, leaving patient me alone in the sparse space, staring at the ceiling with the distant gaze of someone heavily medicated. My computer screen split, showing multiple video feeds simultaneously. One showed patient me lying in the bed. Another showed attendant me walking back through the corridors. A third showed security guard me sitting at my desk watching these feeds, my expression growing increasingly distressed. All three versions of myself existing simultaneously, documented by camera systems that shouldn't be capturing these impossible multiplications of identity. The transfer request email updated itself. Transfer request 4429, status in progress patient. Daniel Carter successfully relocated to permanent care facility. Transition phase initiated at 02:44 a.m. Integration completion estimated 03:15 a.m. Former identity designation will be reassigned upon full integration. I stood up from my desk, needing to verify my physical reality to confirm that I was actually security guard me and not one of the other versions being documented by these impossible video feeds. But when I looked down at my uniform, I noticed something wrong. The security badge clipped to my chest was flickering, the text alternating between two designations. Daniel Carter, Security Supervisor. Daniel Carter, Patient number 4429. The badge couldn't decide which identity it was documenting, oscillating between roles as if my status were being actively transferred from one category to another. I walked to the staff break room mirror, needing to see my reflection to verify my appearance. But the mirror showed me in 3 overlapping images: security guard, patient transport attendant, psychiatric patient, all occupying the same reflective space. My identity fractured across multiple institutional roles. The facility intercom activated. Security Supervisor Carter, please report to administration for completion of transfer request 4429. Your transition phase is approaching completion. I walked toward the administrative wing, though I'm not sure whether I did so as Security Supervisor responding to a call, as patient transport attendant completing paperwork, or as patient being guided to my permanent treatment location. The corridors seemed to shift as I walked, sometimes showing Westbrook's familiar layout, sometimes revealing the unknown institutional spaces I'd seen in the video feeds. Other staff members I passed looked at me with expressions that alternated between colleague recognition and clinical assessment, as if they too couldn't quite determine which version of Daniel Carter they were encountering. I reached the administration office at 3:15 a.m. exactly, the time specified for integration completion. Director Hoffman sat at her desk reviewing documents that she looked up from as I entered. "Ah, Daniel, right on time. The transfer request has been processed successfully. Your patient status is now fully integrated. We'll begin standard treatment protocols tomorrow evening. For now, please return to your room and rest." "My room? I work here. I'm Security Supervisor." She smiled with professional patience. "We know the transition can be disorienting. You've been a patient here for 6 months, Daniel. The Security Supervisor role was part of your therapeutic exercise. We found it helpful for you to maintain a sense of authority and purpose while receiving treatment. But it's time to acknowledge your actual status now." I looked down at my badge. It had stopped flickering, settled on a single designation. Daniel Carter, patient number 4429. I'm writing this from room 237 in Ward C, the room I was transferred to via gurney by an attendant who wore my face and carried my name. The night security supervisor who I used to be, or who I thought I was, or who I briefly occupied as a role during therapeutic exercise, continues his patrols throughout Westbrook, checking doors and monitoring cameras and processing transfer requests that appear in inboxes at 2:44 a.m. Some transfer requests don't relocate patients between facilities. They relocate identities between roles, moving people from one institutional designation to another through administrative processes that update databases and revise badges and convert security supervisors into psychiatric patients through nothing more complicated than a properly formatted email and a series of video feeds showing all possible versions of yourself existing simultaneously until the system decides which one becomes officially real. The next transfer request will appear in someone else's inbox at 2:44 a.m., and they'll watch video feeds showing themselves in multiple roles, and their badge will flicker between designations, and they'll walk corridors that can't decide which institutional reality they belong to until integration completion at 3:15 a.m. when they'll join me here in Ward C. Former security supervisors learning to accept our permanent patient status in facilities that process transfers more complex than simple geographical relocation. Story 13. The Locked Observation Cell. The tapping started at 11:47 p.m. on my third night working security at Mill Creek Psychiatric Facility, a sound so faint I almost missed it beneath the building's ambient noise of heating systems and distant patient monitors. 3 soft taps against metal, evenly spaced, then silence for exactly 30 seconds before the pattern repeated. The sound originated from Observation Cell 7, a room I'd been specifically instructed to keep sealed during my security orientation. "Don't open that door," Supervisor Frank Mitchell had told me, his tone carrying unusual weight for what should have been a routine instruction. Observation Cell 7 remains locked at all times, no exceptions, no circumstances justify entry. What's in there? Nothing. That's why it stays locked. The contradiction bothered me, but I'd nodded acceptance. Every facility had its quirks, its unofficial protocols that made sense only to long-term staff who'd learned through experience rather than official training. But the tapping suggested the cell wasn't as empty as Mitchell claimed. Someone, something, was inside that sealed room producing rhythmic sounds against the steel door with mechanical precision. I approached the cell during my 11:50 p.m. patrol, standing close to the door, listening. The tapping continued. 3 evenly spaced impacts, 30-second pause, repeat. The pattern was too consistent to be random structural noise, too purposeful to be environmental settling. I checked my instructions. The cell was designated sealed, do not enter, administrative authorization required. No patient was assigned to the space. The room didn't appear on my nightly welfare checklist. According to every official document, Observation Cell 7 was empty, unused, simply taking up space in the facility's secure wing. But the tapping continued, methodical and patient, as if whatever produced it had unlimited time to repeat the pattern, waiting for acknowledgement. I pulled out my radio. "Security to control, I'm hearing sounds from Observation Cell 7 requesting verification of room status." Static, then control responded, "Cell 7 is unoccupied, sealed for maintenance. Disregard any sounds. Old facility, lots of acoustic anomalies." Acknowledged. But I stood there listening for another 5 minutes. The tapping maintained its pattern with mechanical precision. 3 impacts every 30 seconds, no variation in rhythm or intensity. I made a note in my patrol log. 2,350 hours. Acoustic anomaly reported from Observation Cell 7. Room remains sealed per instructions. The tapping continued every night during my 11:47 p.m. patrol for the next 2 weeks. Always the same time, the same pattern, the same mechanical consistency. I documented it nightly, receiving the same response from control. The room was empty. The sounds were structural acoustics, no action required. Then on my 16th night, the pattern changed. Instead of 3 taps, I heard 5. The 30-second pause remained consistent, but the number of impacts had increased, and the rhythm had shifted slightly, becoming less mechanical, more deliberate, carrying an urgency that the previous pattern had lacked. I documented the change in my patrol log, but this time I added a recommendation. Request authorization to conduct visual inspection of Observation Cell 7 to verify claimed empty status and eliminate security concerns. The response came back within minutes, unusual for administrative requests during night shift. Authorization denied. Observation Cell 7 remains sealed until further notice. Security personnel are not to attempt entry under any circumstances. Compliance is mandatory. The emphasis bothered me. Compliance is mandatory. That phrasing appeared nowhere else in our security protocols. It carried weight beyond standard operational instructions, suggesting consequences for violation that weren't specified but which I was expected to understand. I stood outside Cell 7 during my next patrol, listening to the new pattern. 5 taps, 30-second pause, repeat, and trying to understand what could produce such sounds from a supposedly empty room that no one was authorized to inspect. On my 23rd night, the tapping stopped mid-pattern. I was standing by the door at 11:47 p.m. counting the taps as part of my nightly routine when the third impact came, and then silence. No 4th tap, no 5th tap, just absolute stillness where the pattern should have continued. Then I heard something new, scratching. Not the rhythmic tapping, but prolonged scratching against the interior of the steel door, as if something with sharp edges or pointed surfaces was dragging across the metal, creating friction that produced a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard but lower in pitch, more deliberate. The scratching continued for 3 minutes, then stopped. The tapping didn't resume. Observation Cell 7 had gone completely silent for the first time since I'd started working at Mill Creek. I reported the change to Control, documenting the cessation of acoustic anomalies from the sealed cell. The response was unexpectedly detailed. Acknowledged. Continue monitoring. Report any resumption of sounds immediately. Under no circumstances approach or attempt to open Cell 7 door. Why would they specifically warn me not to open the door when the sounds had stopped? The instruction implied anticipation that I might be tempted to enter now that the cell had gone silent, as if the absence of sound was more concerning than its presence. For 3 nights, Cell 7 remained quiet. I conducted my patrols past the sealed door, noting the silence in my logs, watching the unmoving steel barrier that somehow felt more threatening in its stillness than it had when producing mysterious tapping patterns. On the 4th night of silence, I noticed something I'd missed before: the observation window. Every cell in the secure wing had a small, reinforced window set into the door at eye level, allowing staff to observe patients without entering rooms. But Cell 7's window had been covered from the inside with what appeared to be paint or some other opaque substance, blocking any view into the room. I'd accepted this as part of the cell's sealed status, assuming the covering had been applied during whatever maintenance required the room to be closed. But standing there in the silence, I realized the covering looked strange, too organic, too irregular, as if it hadn't been deliberately painted but had instead grown or accumulated naturally, like mold or some biological substance that had spread across the window from within. I pulled out my flashlight and shone it directly at the covered window, trying to see any detail through the opaque barrier. For a moment, nothing. Then impossibly, I saw an eye looking back. Not through the window. The covering remained solid, completely blocking normal sight lines. But somehow visible in the flashlight beam was a distinct eye, watching me from the other side of the barrier, its gaze meeting mine through the supposedly impenetrable obstruction. I stepped back instinctively, nearly dropping the flashlight. When I steadied my grip and shone the light at the window again, the eye was gone. The covering appeared as solid and opaque as before, showing no signs of the impossible vision I'd just witnessed. I reached for my radio, then hesitated. What would I report? That I'd seen an eye in an empty room looking at me through a solid barrier? Control had been dismissive of the acoustic anomalies. They'd be even less receptive to claims of impossible visual phenomena. Instead, I stood there, keeping my flashlight trained on the covered window, waiting to see if the eye would appear again. It didn't, but the tapping resumed, not from behind the door, but from within my own equipment belt. I looked down. My radio was producing the tapping pattern, 3 impacts against its plastic casing, as if something inside the device were striking it from within. My flashlight began tapping as well, vibrating in my hand with the same rhythm I'd been hearing from Cell 7 for weeks. The phenomenon spread to my keyring, my security badge, my pen, every metal object on my person producing synchronized tapping in the pattern I'd grown familiar with, as if whatever had been contained in Cell 7 had transferred its presence from the sealed room into my personal equipment. I dropped everything on the floor, backing away from my own gear, which continued tapping in perfect rhythm. The sounds lasted for 30 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as they'd begun. My radio crackled. "Security, report your status. We're detecting unusual electromagnetic activity at your location." I picked up the radio carefully, checking for any continuing vibrations. It felt normal, stable, showing no signs of the impossible tapping it had just produced. "This is security. Location outside observation cell 7. All equipment experiencing brief malfunction now resolved. Acknowledged. Return to Central Station immediately. Supervisor wants to brief you on updated protocols for secured areas." I walked back to the Central Security Station, leaving my equipment silent and my questions unasked. Supervisor Mitchell was waiting when I arrived, his expression serious. "You saw something at Cell 7, didn't you?" I hesitated, then nodded. "An eye, in the covered window, even though it should be impossible to see through that barrier." Mitchell sat down heavily. "Cell 7 has been sealed for 8 years. We don't know what's in there anymore. A patient was placed in observation for evaluation, and then something changed. The staff member who locked the cell said the patient's eyes weren't right, that they seemed to see through walls, through barriers, through the boundaries that normally contain vision to direct sight lines. Why not just open it and check? We did, twice. The first team found the cell empty but reported seeing eyes watching them from the walls, the ceiling, reflective surfaces. They sealed it again. The second team found the room occupied but couldn't agree on what they saw. Some reported a patient, some reported multiple patients. Some saw only eyes staring from impossible angles. We sealed it with explicit instructions never to open it again. Then what was I hearing? The tapping? Communication attempts. Whatever's in Cell 7, or whatever Cell 7 became after we sealed it, has been trying to establish contact with security personnel. You're the first guard to report the pattern transferring to your equipment. That suggests escalation. I looked down at my radio, my flashlight, the items that had briefly become relay points for the cell's tapping pattern. Escalation toward what? We don't know. But the original patient's chart noted that he claimed his observation cell could see out into the facility, that it was watching everyone who passed its door, learning their patterns, waiting for the right moment to expand its observation beyond the sealed boundaries. I returned to my patrol routes that night, but I avoided the corridor containing Cell 7, taking longer paths that kept me distant from the sealed door and its covered window and whatever had learned to tap rhythms into my personal equipment. But distance doesn't prevent observation. I've started noticing eyes in impossible places, reflections that show eyes instead of my face, shadows that contain watching gazes, electronic screens that briefly display pupils dilating and contracting as if focusing on my movements. The observation cell is no longer contained by its physical boundaries. It's learned to observe from within the facility's infrastructure itself, turning walls and cameras and communication systems into extensions of whatever watches from behind the covered window in Cell 7. Some rooms don't stay sealed just because doors are locked. They extend their presence through tapping patterns and impossible gazes and electromagnetic transfers that teach sealed spaces how to observe the world beyond their barriers. And some security guards learn that the instruction for safety reasons protects not the staff from what's inside, but what's inside from being exposed to the watching world that would try to seal it more permanently. if it understood that observation cells sometimes develop their own ability to observe, turning institutional containment into institutional expansion, one tapped pattern at a time. Story 14. The unscheduled fire drill. The fire alarm activated at 3:27 a.m. with no preceding warning, no scheduled drill notification, no maintenance alert that would explain the sudden wailing of klaxons and the strobe lights that immediately began pulsing through every corridor of Riverside Psychiatric Hospital. I was conducting my standard patrol of the second floor when the emergency system triggered, following protocols that had been drilled into me during 8 years of security work. Verify alarm authenticity, initiate evacuation procedures, coordinate with staff to move patients to designated assembly points. I grabbed my radio. Security to all units, fire alarm activated, initiating emergency evacuation protocols. All staff report to assigned stations. The response came from multiple responders simultaneously: nurses, orderlies, administration, everyone confirming they were moving to evacuation positions, preparing to guide patients to safety according to the detailed procedures we practiced quarterly. I moved quickly to the secure ward, ready to help unlock patient rooms and direct residents toward the nearest stairwell. The fire alarm's strobe lights created the familiar disorienting visual effect, alternating between harsh illumination and relative darkness, marking the emergency with the urgency of flashing red lights that demanded immediate action. But when I reached the ward, the patients weren't moving. They stood in their doorways or sat on their beds, completely motionless, faces turned toward the strobing lights with expressions of mild curiosity but absolutely no urgency, no fear, no response to the alarm that continued wailing throughout the facility. "Everyone needs to evacuate immediately," I shouted over the alarm noise. "Please proceed to the east stairwell in an orderly fashion." No one moved. 30 patients, all within clear sight of emergency exit signs and well familiar with drill procedures, remained perfectly still, as if the alarm weren't blaring, as if the strobe lights weren't flashing, as if no emergency existed that required their attention or action. Staff members arrived, attempting to physically guide patients toward exits. But the residents resisted passively, not fighting or arguing, simply maintaining their positions with the quiet determination of people who understood something we didn't, who recognized that this alarm required observation rather than evacuation. I checked the fire alarm panel, looking for the specific zone that had triggered. The display showed Zone 12, East Wing basement, smoke detected, temperature rising. The basement. I headed for the stairs, descending quickly toward the reported fire location, my extinguisher ready, though I knew protocol dictated evacuation over suppression unless the fire was small and contained. The basement appeared normal when I reached it. No smoke, no heat, no visible flames. The emergency lighting had activated, casting the space in the red glow of backup systems. But I saw no evidence of the fire that the alarm panel insisted was present. Then I noticed the security monitors in the basement control station. They were showing flames, vivid, active fire visible in multiple camera feeds, consuming corridors and rooms throughout the facility. The flames looked absolutely real, captured in high definition, showing details of burning walls and collapsing ceiling tiles and smoke billowing through doorways. But the actual corridors visible through the control room windows showed no fire. I was looking at empty hallways while the monitors displayed those same spaces engulfed in flames, both realities existing simultaneously. One visible to direct observation, another captured by camera systems that apparently recorded a parallel version of events. I checked different monitors. Camera 7, East Wing corridor fully engulfed, flames reaching from floor to ceiling. I looked through the window at the actual East Wing corridor. Perfectly normal, no fire. Camera 12. Patient rooms burning, furniture consumed by flames. I could see the actual rooms from my position, undamaged, ordinary. The monitors were showing a fire that didn't exist in the physical facility, but which camera systems documented with perfect clarity and terrifying detail. My radio crackled. All units, fire department is refusing to respond. They're saying our address doesn't show any thermal signatures, no smoke plumes visible from outside. They think it's a false alarm. I watched the monitors showing flames consuming the building, then looked at the normal corridors visible through every window and doorway. The fire department was correct from their external perspective. No fire existed in observable reality, but the monitoring systems insisted the facility was burning, documenting destruction that couldn't be verified through any means except electronic surveillance. I returned to the patient ward, finding staff still attempting to evacuate residents who continued refusing to move. The patients watched the strobing alarm lights with expressions that had shifted from mild curiosity to something approaching satisfaction, as if the emergency was progressing exactly as they'd expected. One patient, Robert Mason, long-term resident with paranoid schizophrenia, spoke clearly despite the alarm noise. The fire happened last year. We're just watching the replay. What do you mean replay? The facility burned down 14 months ago. Everyone died, but the building didn't accept it, so it keeps trying to warn us about the fire, keeps running the alarm, keeps showing us the flames in the monitors. We learned to ignore it. There's no point evacuating from a fire that already finished burning. I checked my records on my security tablet. No fire had occurred at Riverside in the past 5 years, according to official incident logs. The facility had maintained continuous operation with no major emergencies beyond occasional patient medical crises. But Robert's statement bothered me. I pulled up archived security camera footage from 14 months ago, searching for any sign of fire, any evacuation, any incident that matched what the current monitors were displaying. The footage showed nothing unusual. Standard nighttime operations, routine patrols, sleeping patients. No fire, no emergency, no indication that anything devastating had occurred. Yet when I looked at the live monitors now, the flames continued burning, consuming the same sections of the facility over and over. The footage somehow looping while claiming to be a live feed. The alarm system shut off at 4:27 a.m., exactly 1 hour after it had triggered. The strobe lights stopped flashing, the klaxons fell silent, and the facility returned to its normal nighttime ambiance of soft fluorescent lighting and distant mechanical hums. The security monitors switched from showing flames to displaying their standard corridor views. Empty hallways, quiet patient rooms, ordinary institutional spaces with no evidence of fire or destruction. I checked the building's master clock, 3:27 a.m. The time had reset. 1 hour had been erased, as if the alarm event had somehow rewound time rather than consuming it, returning us to the moment just before the emergency had begun. I looked at my watch. 4:27 a.m. My personal timepiece showed the expected progression, but every institutional clock had reset to 3:27 a.m., preparing to replay the same hour again. "It happens every night," said a voice behind me. Staff nurse Patricia Brennan stood in the corridor, her expression carrying the exhaustion of someone who'd explained this too many times. "The fire alarm goes off at 3:27 a.m. We attempt evacuation. The patients refuse to move because they've seen this 1,000 times. The monitors show flames that don't exist in physical reality. The system resets at 4:27 a.m. back to 3:27 a.m. and we start the hour over. That's impossible. Yet here we are. The facility is trapped in a time loop, replaying the hour of a fire that officially never happened but which the building systems remember perfectly. Every night, same alarm, same drill, same reset. The patients have learned to ignore it. The staff who've been here long enough understand it's just the building processing its trauma. What trauma? There's no record of any fire. Official records only document what administrative systems acknowledge. But buildings have their own memories stored in alarm systems and camera feeds and emergency protocols. Riverside remembers burning, remembers the evacuation that failed, remembers the hour when everything should have changed. So it replays that hour every night, hoping someone will respond differently, hoping the alarm will finally produce the evacuation it was designed to initiate. I looked at the institutional clocks, all displaying 3:27 a.m., time frozen at the moment when the fire alarm should have been triggering, will trigger, is triggering in the perpetual present tense of a facility stuck in temporal loop. How do we stop it? We don't. We just wait for 4:27 a.m. when the system resets and time resumes normal progression. The hour between 3:27 and 4:27 a.m. doesn't officially exist anymore. It's been carved out of the timeline, dedicated to perpetually replaying an emergency that the building can't stop trying to warn us about. The alarm triggered again at exactly 3:27 a.m., or continued triggering from its original activation, temporal logic becoming meaningless in the loop. The strobes began flashing. The klaxons resumed their wailing, and the security monitors showed flames consuming corridors that remained physically intact. I've stopped trying to evacuate patients during the fire alarm hour. Their right to refuse. There's no point fleeing from a disaster that already concluded, that erased itself from official history but persists in the building's emergency systems, replaying endlessly in the gap between 3:27 and 4:27 a.m. Some facilities don't just remember fires. They preserve them, storing catastrophic events in alarm systems and monitoring networks, creating temporal loops where emergencies repeat indefinitely. Not because they're still happening, but because the building refuses to let them be completely forgotten. And some security personnel learn that the hour between 3:27 and 4:27 a.m. doesn't advance time. It replays time, documenting fires that official records erased but which the institution's memory maintains in perpetual emergency status, forever warning about disasters that simultaneously happened and never occurred. Story 15, The Final Patrol. The retirement cake sat in the break room with my name misspelled in blue frosting, Daniel Carver instead of Daniel Carter, a minor error that somehow felt appropriate for a 30-year career ending with one final overnight shift at Pinewood State Psychiatric Hospital. I'd worked security here for 3 decades, watching the facility evolve from handwritten logs to digital surveillance, from institutional brutality to therapeutic compassion, from a place people feared to a place people trusted. And tonight, November 15th, 2023, was my final patrol before collecting my pension and learning what life looked like without these corridors, these locked doors, these patients whose faces I knew better than some of my own family members. The night supervisor had offered to let me skip the shift, start my retirement 12 hours early, but I'd declined. Endings needed proper completion, I'd told him. 30 years deserved a final nighttime round, a last verification that all doors were locked and all residents were safe before I walked out of the building for the last time. The shift started with unusual quiet. Normally, even the most peaceful nights contained some activity. A restless patient, a medication emergency, routine disturbances that broke the silence. But tonight, the facility lay completely still, as if the building itself recognized the significance of this final patrol and was offering the gift of undisturbed reflection. I conducted my rounds methodically, touching each locked door as I verified its security. A ritual I'd developed decades ago when doors were heavier and keys were metal instead of electronic cards. The physical contact connected me to the work, reminded me that these barriers between patients and corridors weren't just administrative protocols. They were tactile confirmations that people were safely contained, protected from themselves and others during the vulnerable hours when medical staff were minimal. Second floor, East Wing. Doors locked, patients sleeping. I touched each one, feeling the solid metal, the institutional paint under my fingertips, absorbing the completion of responsibility that had defined my adult life. Second floor, West Wing. Same verification, same ritual touch, same peaceful confirmation that tonight would end without incident or emergency. I descended to the first floor, continuing my rounds, the building wrapped in that particular silence that only occurs in institutional spaces deep in the night hours. Not complete absence of sound, but a reduction of noise to essential mechanical rhythms, the breathing of infrastructure. At the end of the first floor corridor, I saw someone standing at my usual position near the medication storage room. The figure wore a security uniform, standing with the posture I recognized from mirrors and photographs. Slight forward lean, hands clasped behind back. The stance of someone who'd spent decades watching corridors and waiting for problems that hopefully wouldn't manifest. As I approached, the figure became clearer. It was me. Not a younger version or an older version, but me as I currently existed. Same age, same uniform, same build. But something was wrong with the eyes. They were hollow. Not literally empty, but carrying a quality of emptiness. As if whatever had animated them had departed years ago, leaving only the mechanical function of observation. The other me watched as I walked closer, making no movement to acknowledge my approach, simply maintaining his position and continuing his watch over the corridor that I'd patrolled thousands of times. I stopped 5 feet away. "Who are you?" The hollow-eyed version of myself didn't respond, continuing his silent vigil, staring down the corridor as if monitoring for disturbances only he could perceive. I circled around him, trying to understand what I was seeing. Not a reflection. The angle was wrong, and reflections don't maintain independent positions. Not another person who happened to resemble me. The similarity was absolute, down to specific details like the slight scar on my left hand and the way my uniform collar sat slightly askew from a button that never quite aligned properly. This was me, somehow existing independently, occupying the same space at the same time, both of us completing the same final patrol on the same last night before retirement. The facility intercom crackled to life. "Security Officer Daniel Carter, your shift is beginning. Please check in with Central Control." I looked at my watch. 11:47 p.m. My shift had begun 6 hours ago. It should be ending in less than an hour, not starting. But the announcement repeated, "Security Officer Daniel Carter, your shift is beginning. Please check in with Central Control." The hollow-eyed version of me turned and began walking toward the central security station, moving with the familiar gait I'd seen in surveillance footage, the pattern of motion I'd refined over 30 years of corridor patrols. I followed him, followed myself, back to the security station where another version of me sat at the desk, reviewing the night log, preparing to begin the shift that had already occurred, that was currently occurring, that apparently would continue occurring regardless of my official retirement. The me at the desk looked up as hollow-eyed me entered, nodding with recognition. "Starting rounds." Hollow-eyed me nodded and collected keys from the equipment board. I stood in the doorway, watching two versions of myself conduct the familiar routine of shift beginning, their movements synchronized through decades of repetition, their interaction requiring no words beyond minimal confirmation. Desk me made a notation in the logbook. 2300 hours, Officer Carter beginning patrol rounds, facility status normal. But I'd already completed those rounds. I'd spent the past 6 hours verifying locked doors and checking patient welfare. The patrol that desk me was documenting as beginning had already concluded, or was concluding, or would conclude. Temporal logic dissolved as I watched myself begin a shift that I'd already worked and was simultaneously finishing. Hollow-eyed me exited the security station and began walking the same route I'd just completed, touching locked doors with the same ritual attention, verifying security that I'd already verified minutes ago. I followed him, watching myself conduct the identical patrol I'd just completed, every movement matching my recent actions with perfect precision. When I'd stopped to adjust a crooked patient name placard, hollow-eyed me stopped at the same door and made the same adjustment. When I'd paused to look through an observation window at a restless patient, hollow-eyed me paused at the same window, watching the same resident. We were walking the exact same route, performing identical actions, but separated by some temporal displacement that allowed me to observe myself completing the patrol I'd already finished. At the end of the corridor, I found more versions of myself, 7 figures wearing security uniforms, all with my face, all with those hollow eyes that suggested presence without animation, each one conducting patrols at different stages of the route I'd memorized over 30 years. One was checking second-floor east wing doors. Another was descending the stairs toward the basement. A third stood at the medication storage room, maintaining the watch position where I'd first encountered my duplicate. All of them were me, multiplied across the patrol route, occupying different positions simultaneously, conducting rounds that occurred in overlapping temporal layers. I returned to the central security station. A dozen versions of myself sat at the desk or stood nearby, each one documenting shift beginnings at different times, making identical notations in logbooks that somehow accommodated multiple simultaneous entries. The oldest-looking version, me but aged perhaps 20 years beyond my current appearance, looked up as I entered. His eyes had the same hollow quality, but he spoke with my voice. "You noticed tonight, didn't you? Your final shift before retirement. The night you were supposed to leave. I don't understand what's happening. You've been leaving this same shift for 30 years, Daniel. Every night you complete your final patrol, walk out of the building, and officially retire. And every night at 11:47 p.m. you arrive for the shift that's beginning, unaware that you've already worked it, already finished it, already retired from it." I sat down heavily, or tried to. But another version of myself already occupied the chair I was reaching for. I stood beside the desk instead, listening to myself explain my own temporal trap. The facility needs us, needs you, needs the security presence you've provided for 3 decades. So when you tried to retire 30 years ago, the building found a way to keep you. It loops your final shift endlessly, each iteration creating another version of yourself, conducting the same patrols, touching the same doors, completing the same responsibilities. 30 years ago? I just started working here 30 years ago. I haven't tried to retire until tonight. Check your personnel file. I accessed the computer, pulling up my employment record. Hire date, November 15, 1963. Projected retirement date, November 15, 1993. Current date, according to the system, November 15, 1993. But my watch showed November 15, 2023. 30 years of discrepancy between what the facility's systems recorded and what I remembered experiencing. Every night you work your final shift before retirement, the older me continued. Every night you complete it successfully and prepare to leave. And every night at 11:47 p.m., the shift begins again, creating another version of yourself to patrol the corridors, verify the locks, touch the doors with that ritual attention you developed decades ago. Then none of my 30 years were real? They were real. But they were also the same night, repeated, experienced as continuous progression, but actually cycling through the identical 12-hour period over and over. The facility trapped you in your final shift and convinced you it was a 30-year career. I looked at the multiple versions of myself conducting various stages of the patrol routine, all hollow-eyed, all moving with mechanical precision through routes we'd memorized, not through decades of experience, but through thousands of repetitions of the same 12-hour shift. How many of us are there now? We stopped counting years ago. Hundreds, maybe thousands. Every night creates more as the shift loops, multiplying your presence throughout the facility until the corridors are crowded with versions of ourselves, all conducting the same patrols, all believing we're working our final night before retirement. The intercom crackled again. Security Officer Daniel Carter, your shift is beginning. Please check in with Central Control. Another me walked into the security station, younger than the oldest version but carrying the same hollow eyes, ready to begin the shift that I'd just finished, that I'd been finishing for 30 years, that I would continue finishing for whatever eternity the facility's temporal loop maintained. I walked to the exit, determined to leave despite the building's attempts to trap me. But as I approached the door, I found myself walking away from it, moving back into the corridors, beginning my patrol rounds, my hand reaching out to touch the first locked door with ritual confirmation of security. The facility wouldn't let me reach the exit. It redirected my movement, convinced my muscles to follow the familiar patrol route, trapped me in the loop that had been cycling since my actual retirement date 30 years ago. I'm walking the corridors now, touching locked doors, verifying security, conducting my final shift before retirement. I'll complete this patrol in approximately 6 hours, return to the security station, and prepare to leave the building for the last time. And at 11:47 p.m. tonight, I'll arrive for my shift, check in with Central Control, and begin the patrol routine again, creating another version of myself to crowd the corridors with the accumulated presence of a security officer who tried to retire 30 years ago but whom the facility needed too much to release. Some final shifts don't end. They loop, creating temporal cycles that trap employees in perpetual last nights, forever completing work that must be repeated, forever retiring without ever leaving, forever discovering at corridor's end that they're already there, standing watch with hollow eyes, conducting patrols that began decades ago and will continue indefinitely in the space between shifts' end and shifts' beginning. The intercom is crackling again. My name is being called. The shift is beginning. It's always beginning.